Yeah, very good morning to you. We are live from Johannesburg. Yes, another beautiful spring day here in the city of gold. I'm with Elvis Kendall. And today we're in the Supreme Court of Appeal with the President.
We're in Bloemfontein today, Eben, of course, the Supreme Court of Appeal, which will hear the President's arguments today around the 783 charges.
Why those charges should not be reinstated, Kendall. It's of course, lots of conjecture, lots of talk around it. There you see live pictures from the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein that will, well, we expect to be live inside the court at about 10 a.m. But we've got a lot of stuff to get through before we get there. But we're asking you a poll, and we want to know what you guys think with regards to these charges that go back to 2002 when the President was first charged, Kendall.
The big question of the last 2 decades, really. Should the President have his day in court, is what we want to find out from you.
Well, 279 votes in, gentlemen, and 86% of South Africans and people on the continent are suggesting that the President should have his day in court. Only 14% are saying no.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's take a look at your tweets. Who's tweeting what? Who's telling us what? This one from Mañana Tabo, who says, laugh out loud, he will survive on this motion of no confidence.
Artini says, yes, no one is above the law of court.
Well, that's what's happening in court today. But of course, there's also another issue that we want to focus on today, and that is on SAA. You know, the finance minister has now extended the contract of the board chairperson, Mañana.
Yeah, she's been called to Parliament to explain that as well. And of course, on social media, people are going crazy saying, well, she's past the 2-3-year terms that you are supposed to spend that as the chairperson.
Well, she's now 8 years there.
Of the board, 8 years, so 2 years. And of course, a lot of people are trying to
make sense of it.
Blame her for the state of the national airline.
Nimbena comes in with, you know, on this question where we're asking you, what do you make of her extension? Well, Artini says promotion of irregularity.
This one from Evan Rands, the Godfrey, he says, it's well thought and careful plan because she's the one who has discovered the fraud and looting going on at SAA. The DA wants her out to cover
corruption, I would believe that is.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it. These are some of your comments. You can keep them coming. But we're also conducting a sports question today, Kendall. We want to know from people about, hey, are you still Kosi for life?
You know, Kaizer Chiefs, when they win a match, it is national news here in South Africa.
Yes, Evan had to put that one in, didn't he? He's a Buccaneer, as you all know. But Steve Compella and Kaizer Chiefs, they bounced back to beat Cape Town City FC. What are your thoughts on the matter?
And they employ child labor to do it.
Bulelani says, Steve is not a player. Don't blame him for everything.
That is true.
Chiefs
this Wiseman Meyiwa, 17-year-old boy, came in, did the business for Chiefs last night.
Sakumzi says, I still believe that Compella should be relieved from his duties as the coach and be placed somewhere within the Kaizer Chiefs' technical structure as philosopher of life. Well, I added that. That's not you.
Yeah, everybody loves Steve Compella as a Orlando Pirates man. Myself, I'm glad that you now have Steve for the rest of this season. Thank you.
Well, that's where we got to leave it. Let's get down to business. The Supreme Court of Appeal will today hear President Jacob Zuma and the National Prosecuting Authority's appeal against the High Court ruling relating to the spy tape saga. National Union of Mine Workers is expected to approach the High Court in Pretoria today to support the Mineral Resources Minister Mosebenzi Zwane in his battle with the Chamber of Mines to implement the new mining charter. And Parliament's Standing Committee on Public Enterprises have given the Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba a week in which to explain the extension of SAA Board Chairperson Mañana's term of office. Now those are your headlines, but before we get to the news, Let's find out from Kendall Makamate what's happening on the sports front.
You know what I find fascinating, because you're a Buccaneer, you're a course for life, you know. And the little tete-a-tete we have before the show is always great. I wish sometimes we'd start the show when you guys are talking about Chiefs and Pirates. Good morning to you. I love my job. This is what we've got for you in the sports today. Steve Compella's decision to give teenager Wiseman Mayweather a first-time start turns into a stroke of genius as the youngster fires Amakosi to a much-needed win in Cape Town.
Chance for number 2. It's all over now. There you were on debut. And Kaiser Chiefs are heading to all 3 points.
And Cristiano Ronaldo marks his return from suspension with another brace as Real Madrid crush Apoel FC 3-0 in the UEFA Champions League group stage match.
Gareth Bale looking for Ronaldo. 1-0 Real Madrid. In the blink of an eye.
Here we go. Bam! Wow! What a shot!
Tisara Pereira smashes the World 11 to a series-leveling win over Pakistan in an electric match that goes down to the last 2 balls. All this and more a little later in the Sports Bulletin. I'll also be chatting to Evan about 9:50 so about the Springbok squad that's been announced to play the All Blacks over the weekend. But all this a little later. Stay with Elvis as he's got the news.
Thank you, Kendall. Top story this hour. The DA's James Self says that his party is trying to give President Jacob Zuma his day in court. Speaking to SABC News this morning, Self went on to say that the president has little chance of winning this case as the High Court in Pretoria found that the dropping of the charges was illegal.
Been at this for 8.5 years. We're now at the second last court that we can go to. But at issue here is, as you say, there is one law in South Africa. It applies to everyone, whether you are the president of South Africa or a homeless person. There is one law. He has been charged. A court has found unanimously that the dropping of the charges was illegal, irrational, and has set it aside. The appeal is now being heard. But if we win, then as far as we're concerned, Jacob Zuma is an accused person, like everybody else would be an accused person, and he must be summoned to a court and indicted accordingly.
Certainly not the end of this matter, because even if you look through President Jacob Zuma's court papers, they argue this issue around should the NPA decide to uphold and implement this decision by the High Court, that will give rise to an application for a permanent stay. Would the DA then also be involved in such a matter?
Well, of course, because really the issue is one of principle. The issue cannot be allowed to be frustrated at the last minute by legal shenanigans. Jacob Zuma has always said, I want my day in court. What we're trying to do is to give him his day in court.
Now for the latest, we now go live to our SABC reporter Aldrin Sampear, who's in Bloemfontein. A very good morning to you, Aldrin. And can you tell us what we can expect from the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein today?
Well, certainly we'll hear the arguments from President Jacob Zuma as to why he believes that the court decision in April last year that he should face the charges in the indictment dating back to 2009 is unfair on him, and why he believes that Mkhothadi Mshe's decision on April the 1st, 2009 was a correct decision to drop the charges against President Jacob Zuma. And even if you go through the documents of the President Council, they argue that it was a rational decision and it would have been irrational for Mkhothadi Mshe to go ahead with the prosecution, considering on his own account he speaks around the veracity of the abuse, the serious abuse of process that Leonard McCarthy, the serious abuse of process by Leonard McCarthy in President Jacob Zuma's corruption case. And that's some of the matters that we're expecting to hear from this court case today, but also from the NPA side as well, and why they believe that the court saying that President Jacob Zuma should face the charges in essence takes away its its power as the NDPP and the NPA, which has, they believe, the sole discretionary power in deciding when to prosecute and when not to prosecute. And if you listen to Deputy Judge President Lidwaba's arguments when he handed down the judgment on refusing to grant leave to appeal to the NPA as well as President Jacob Zuma, he states that the court did not decide and did not direct the NDPP to prosecute President Jacob Zuma, but rather stating that the charges against President Jacob Zuma should be reinstated. The President's Counsel say that in essence that means that President Jacob Zuma should face the charges, and that means that the NDPP should prosecute President Jacob Zuma. So those are just some of the arguments that we expect to be heard in court today. But also we have the DA, as you've heard there from James Self, who've been saying that this matter, they've been fighting this matter for 8 years and a half, and just heard now that the DA has spent close to 10 million rand in trying to get President Jacob Zuma to appear before a court of law and have the charges against him tested in front of a court of law.
The Commission of Inquiry found that nobody unduly benefited from the arms deal, so to speak. So why is this case still in front of the court?
Well, remember that the Sariti Commission of Inquiry was looking into the arms deal matter. And this case stems back from 2004-2005, the Judge Squire judgment that was handed down in the Shabir Sheikh matter, where the court found there was credence to the argument made by the prosecutors at the time that there is a corrupt relationship between President Jacob Zuma and Shabir Sheikh. It also found that the monies that was paid to President Jacob Zuma does meet the definition of corruption as well as bribes. And at the time, Downer, who was leading the prosecution, said that they can't ignore the court ruling. And Vusi Pikolu, who was the NDPP at the time, then decided that President Jacob Zuma should face the charges. But a whole lot of other cases then emerged after that, including some cases that came to the Supreme Court of Appeal. One of those cases being the search and seizure of documents at President Jacob Zuma's office as well as his home in Kilani. So this case basically stems from that court ruling that was handed down at that time. And the DA still believes that President Jacob Zuma should have his day in court and he should answer to these corruption charges. And the veracity of these corruption charges should be tested in a court of law. Also in issue here is whether it must be a court of law that decides whether the abuse of process is so serious that it would taint the prosecution of an accused. And remember that Mkoteri Mshe said it is only the process that has been seriously abused, the process that has been seriously abused, and not the corruption prosecution itself that has been abused. So those will be some of the elements that this court will have to be looking into as well.
How important is this case for the president to win this particular appeal?
Well, certainly any matter relating to this case is important for the president. Any outcome is important for the president, but also for South Africans as well. And if you listen to what Judge Lidwaba said and the argument from dismissing the argument from the NPA that argued that the reason that they dropped the charges against President Jacob Zuma is because they felt that the independence of the NPA was in the spotlight and it was compromised by the conduct of then Scorpions head Leonard McCarthy. And that's the reason why this matter is so important for South Africans, but also for President Jacob Zuma on the other hand, because if this court upholds the decision by the High Court that President Jacob Zuma should face the charges, then that would mean that Sean Abrams, the NDPP, would have to sit down and decide whether to go ahead and prosecute President Jacob Zuma. But then on the other hand, President Jacob Zuma's counsel has already indicated that should that decision be taken to prosecute President Jacob Zuma, it would give rise to an application for a permanent stay. But back in 2009 already, in February rather, when President Jacob Zuma went to court, they made an application to have an application of a permanent stay being heard in May that year in 2009. And that's another issue that Judge Lidwaba raises. He said that why was why did Mkotedi Mshe feel so pressured in making a decision to drop the charges against the president when the case of permanent stay, the application for permanent stay, would have been heard 6 weeks, plus minus 6 weeks later in that year. And all indications point to the elections that were taking place that year on the 22nd of April, and also President Jacob Zuma's counsel, who indicated to Mkotedi Mshe and the prosecution team at the time that they need a decision. They need the NPA to decide whether they will prosecute or not, because President Jacob Zuma expects to be inaugurated in May.
Now, Eldrin, we're seeing live pictures coming to from the court and getting ready for the preparation. What time are we supposed to be in court?
Well, yes, as you can see in the live pictures inside the courtroom, President Jacob Zuma's counsel President Jacob Zuma's lawyer, Michael Hali, has arrived. We saw the counsel representing the DA also here. The court case is expected to start around about quarter to 10 this morning. But quite interestingly, looking at what's happening in the courtroom today is the public gallery is not as packed as it was back in 2009. And I just want to bring in Deboho here, who is one of the SABC's local reporters here in Bloemfontein. And he's been covering this case dating back as far back as 2009. And Deboho, just looking at the visuals inside the courtroom and looking what's happening outside the courtroom as well. Quite a stark contrast to what was happening at the time.
Definitely it is, because if you recall at that time, the SACP, COSATU, the entire alliance were in support of President Jacob Zuma at the time, whereby they felt that the charges were politically motivated at that time. Even outside the court, protesters, members of the supporters of the ANC, members, so to speak, were outside supporting the president at that particular moment. But, well, years later, we see a complete different picture. The gallery is literally packed by members of the media. It seems as if the case has attracted the interest of the media more than the interest of political formations, as was the case back then. This time around, it is the Democratic Alliance who are now in the picture, for which when the matter started back then, they were like any other person, except when they felt that the reinstatement of charges here was irrational. Hence, they took the matter to court. The last time when we were here on this particular matter, it was whether the spy tapes should be released or not, whereby KMJ, the counsel for the president, conceded in this very same court that they had no reason to withhold those tapes. So others would feel that this is a delaying tactic, given that the NPA and the president could have petitioned the Constitutional Court directly, but they said they need to follow processes. Follow the processes,
indeed. And just going back to what's happening outside the courtroom, and of course, in 2009, President, Jacob Zuma was then only just the president of the ANC, not even the president of the country, but it was ahead of the election. So it was quite important for the ANC. Even during President Jacob Zuma's rape trial, there were protesters outside the courtroom saying, hands off Jacob Zuma, speaking about his innocence. And quite strangely, today, Jacob Zuma is the president of the country, but not just the president of the country, but is also the president of the ANC. And one then draws the assumption that, considering that his term as the president of the ANC is coming to an end, there is not that much hype around the ANC, and considering that the ANC is facing its own internal battles at the moment.
I think that is one of the reasons. As we know now, COSATU have since left this corner, because they were quite vocal at that time. The SACP, as we know, their position currently, they are no longer in this corner. These were part of the formations at that time who were mobilizing vigorously for the president, even the ANC. This time around, if you look at the ANC, it is no longer as united as it was at that time, because the general feeling at the time was that this was a process to frustrate the president, Jacob Zuma at that time, to become the president. So this time around, the views are different, as we know that the ANC is kind of like a divided house as to who should succeed the president at this time around. Perhaps those who still support President Zuma, we would have expected them to be here today. We were told initially that even supporters of the Democratic Alliance will be here to chant, sing, and as was the case even when during the spy tapes, the releasing and so forth, they were here in large numbers. Today we're told they will be here, but most unfortunately, as you can see, the security has since changed things outside. It would appear that none of the protesters will be at court today.
Well, certainly this court case also speaks to the current political landscape that the country finds itself in, We're considering what's happening inside the ANC ahead of the elective conference. And as we've indicated, outside the courtroom, literally no protesters compared to back in 2009 ahead of the April 22nd elections that were supposed to have been taking place. At the time, things are very, very different. A stark contrast indeed to what was happening back in 2009 and what's happening now, where President Jacob Zuma is fighting to stay out of court and have these corruption charges against him dropped, and ensuring that the prosecution against him does not go ahead.
Aldrin, thank you so much for that report. We'll go back to you live a little bit later. That was our SABC reporter, Aldrin Sampear. And of course, as you heard from him, the president is fighting to stay out of court. And that's why we're asking you this question on the poll. Let's take a look. Eben, we're asking the question here this morning: should the president have his day in court?
Well, obviously it's an overwhelming yes at the moment. It looks like 85% of our respondents and viewers are saying they believe that the president should have his day in court. And, you know, a kind of theme that's doing the round is this one about all equal before the law. It's doing quite a lot on social media, with a lot of people feeling that's it. And it's kind of showing in this poll that we're conducting. 339 votes in. The majority, vast majority, are saying yes, the president should have his day in court. Of course, the DA told us a little bit earlier that, well, it's 8.5 years in the making. But for those who don't know, this comes from 2002 is when the first charges were laid against President Jacob Zuma. But what are you guys tweeting us? Here we go. Nazim Grootboom, he says to us, Newsroom, he must have his day in court, just like any other corrupt officials. Well, it's to be tested, I suppose. He says, or says others.
He says, yes, I think it will also set a good precedent for the future presidents of South Africa.
Yeah, it talks to accountability there. This one from Mahafa Noel says to us, he has to, why not? We've been focusing on Zuma and his family for quite long instead of focusing on matters concerning the country. Yeah, that's another story, Elvis, that's quite interesting. A lot of people are talking about being obsessed, playing the man, being obsessed with an individual and leaving the other order of business, I don't know, a little bit behind schedule here in South Africa.
Social inequality that we have in the country. Yeah. As we know, there's a country of rich and very poor in this country.
We'll be talking to some experts shortly as we build up to 10 o'clock. You know, we'll be live in there. But I'm also going to get Lesiba Tefa to give us a considered view after the break. But I think first you've got to give us a little bit more news of us.
Let's continue with that. The National Union of Mine Workers is expected to approach the High Court in Pretoria as an intervening party in the matter between the Chamber of Mines and the Mineral Resources Minister Mosebenzi Zwane this morning. The Chamber is in court to interdict Zwane from implementing the new mining charter. The NUM says that it has opted to intervene in the case to protect the interests of workers as beneficiaries of the mining charter. It further says that the main reason for the application is that after studying both the Minister of Mineral Resources responding affidavit and the Chamber of Mines, they found the founding affidavits thereof, it then decided that there are areas in which it will negatively affect its members. Meanwhile, members of Parliament's Standing Committee on Public Enterprises have given the Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba a week in which to explain the extension of SAA Board Chairperson Dudu Myeni's term in office. They say there are others who can be appointed to the position. Myeni's term ended at the end of August, but Gigaba extended it until the company's annual general meeting in November. Deputy Finance Minister Sifiso Buthelezi says that the extension was granted in terms of the SAA Memorandum of Incorporation.
Dudu Myeni's leadership at the helm of the national carrier has been dogged by controversy. Her initial term was extended by 1 year when it ended last year. It's now been extended again until the AGM.
The normal practice is that the minister, although the minister is the identified person with the authority to appoint such boards or chairpersons of boards, normal practice is that it would go to Cabinet for approval. But we hear from you that it did not go to Cabinet for approval.
The Deputy Chair take over with immediate effect and that the legality of it be dealt with.
in a way that will determine whether the meetings of the board chaired by Mr. Mañana since the 1st of September have any legal application.
Because if you insist that a person who is irregularly appointed or illegally appointed presides over SAA process, it will mean that the decisions that are going to be taken there are not legal decisions.
Mañana did not attend the meeting for health reasons, and Gigaba had other commitments. It was up to his deputy to provide an explanation.
I gave the reasons for extension. That there is a board evaluation and the minister wanted to look at the board holistically. So I'm not going to go and find a reason anywhere else. That's the reason.
On the face of it, Parliament says Gigaba's decision is illegal.
Clause 13.5 of the MOI, in my reading, does not give the authority for the extension. Okay, that's all I'm saying on that.
Meanwhile, Buthelezi has rejected suggestions this was a political decision, saying it's a business decision. What complicates the matter worse is that credit lenders to SAA have expressed concern at Dudu Mañana's leadership and are reluctant to extend loan facilities to the airline. The struggling national carrier has loan facilities to the tune of 7 billion rand that are maturing soon and need to be repaid. Ulelani Philip, SABC News, Parliament.
The former deputy, in fact, before we go to that next story, let's just remind you of that question that we ask on our question of the day today. What do you make of SAA's board chairperson, Dudu Mañana's extension of her contract? I want to know from you on the Facebook page as well as on the Twitter handle at SABC Newsroom. Let's take a look. This one from Onuke says, is good for SAA. She gave the live wire that still sustained the airline. This one from Meg Robb says, this is what happens when you have friends in high places. Those are some of your comments. Please keep them coming. We'll read them as we continue, but let's continue with some more news. The former Deputy Higher Education Minister will be sentenced next month after pleading guilty to 3 counts of assault. Appearing in court yesterday, he described how he kicked and punched 2 women in a Johannesburg nightclub.
This is the assault incident that has already cost Mañana his ministerial position. And now he has pleaded guilty to all the charges against him.
Together with my legal team, we came to a conclusion to plead guilty. In my first statement, I did extend my apology to the family, to the victims. I intend apologizing once the sentence has been delivered, but truly, I want justice to be served. It mustn't, obviously, doesn't have to favor me.
Inside the courtroom, many scuffles broke out between pro and anti-Mañana groups, some of which had gathered earlier outside.
We are in no way condoning violence, but we're saying beyond the court cases, we must have other conversations about the fact that this is one of the few leaders, if not only in South Africa, who has shown remorse after an incident.
Dudu Mañana must resign as a member of parliament. I mean, who is he representing? Absolutely. If you are a member of parliament, you are representing a constituency. Who is he representing? A man that has a fragile ego that can lift his hand to a woman simply because she made a comment.
In a surprise move, 2 other men believed to have been involved in the altercation at the nightclub were nabbed.
One gentleman was arrested within the building of the court when he was together with Mr. Mañana attending the same court proceedings. And the other one was later arrested and was told to actually hand himself over.
They were pointed out by the victims who also attended proceedings. While the victims say they are not ready to speak and rushed past the media, Mañana, on the other hand, took time to thank his supporters outside court. Mañana says his bail conditions currently bar him from speaking to the victims or their families, but he says he hopes to formally apologize once the matter has been finalized. He will be sentenced on November the 7th. Criselda Lewis, SABC News, at the Randburg Magistrates Court.
Scuffles broke out at last night's memorial service for the late ANC Mzimkhulu councillor and the former ANC Youth League General Secretary Sindiso Magaka at the University of Johannesburg Soweto campus. Magaka died in hospital last week after spending 2 months being treated for gunshot wounds that he suffered in an ambush.
Officials allege that Youth League and COSAS members at the memorial service clashed over seating arrangements and songs. Security battled to control the rowdy crowd. Despite the interruptions, the memorial service proceeded, with several of Magaka's colleagues and friends sharing their messages of condolences to the family.
He was uncompromising and on his convictions. So that is the message that we're imparting, and also saying to the youth of this country, they must make sure that his views and his ideals, they stand forever.
But others claim the scuffles were due to factional fighting. With one group of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma supporters fighting those who support Cyril Ramaphosa's camp.
It is very disrespectful and it is uncalled for such a thing to happen, especially if people come to such platforms wearing factional t-shirts.
No, not here. Here it was not about that, at least from what I saw and from what they explained.
Magaka was shot in a suspected ambush in Mzimkhulu in July and died at a Durban hospital last week. His family is devastated, as they believed he was on the mend.
Very devastated because Sindiso was actually a pillar of his home, although he was the youngest. But he would make sure that everybody is happy. There's always food on the table for the family.
The Hawks are reportedly investigating allegations that Magaka could have been poisoned while on the road to recovery. Nozintombi Mia, SABC News, University of Johannesburg.
And that's your news for now. Now let's start our conversation on our big story today. It's over to Eben.
Yeah, thanks, Elvis. A very good morning to you if you have just joined us. Now, we'll be live inside of the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein at 10 o'clock. We expect proceedings to get underway this morning with very technical arguments. Of course, the Supreme Court normally deals with issues of review in the lower courts, and that will be the case today. But let's just recap. Of course, the Supreme Court of Appeal will hear President Jacob Zuma and the National Prosecuting Authority's appeal against a High Court ruling relating to what is known as the spy tapes saga. Now, the appeal follows a ruling in April of last year in which a judge ordered a review of a 2009 decision by the NPA to set aside hundreds of charges against the president, describing the original ruling as irrational. Now, this effectively reinstated the 783 fraud, racketeering and corruption charges withdrawn by the former NPA head, Moko Tedimche, paving the way for Jacob Zuma to become president in 2009. Now, both the president and the NPA then approached the Supreme Court of Appeal after the High Court refused the request for this appeal.
It's the 12th of January 2009, a few months before the 4th Democratic General Elections. The Supreme Court sent jitters through the political landscape. The NPA successfully petitioned the court to overturn a 2008 High Court ruling which essentially barred it from prosecuting Jacob Zuma.
A prosecution is not wrongful merely because it is brought for an improper purpose.
Fast forward 8 years later, in the same court, the NPA is now in President Jacob Zuma's corner, this time challenging a High Court ruling that it was irrational to drop the charges against President Zuma in 2009.
Mr. Zuma should face the charges as outlined in the indictment.
The court held that the acting NPA head, Mokotedi Mpshe, acted impulsively after listening to the recorded conversations between his predecessor, Bulelani Ngcuka, and former Scorpions boss, Leonard McCarthy. The president contends that the abuse of process forced Mpshe to use his legal powers and drop the prosecution. In the court papers, the President's Counsel raises a quagmire. They say the High Court essentially forces the NPA to prosecute President Jacob Zuma, even though the NPA has indicated that such a prosecution would be unfair to the accused. It says that should the NPA implement the court ruling, it will give rise to an application for a permanent stay, and the NPA would then have to oppose it. The DA maintains Zuma must have his day in court.
We are in it for the principle that nobody in South Africa, whether that person is the President of South Africa or the person living on the street, is above the law, and that the law applies equally to everyone.
The matter has been set down for Thursday and Friday. Aldrin Simpier, SABC News.
Now, for some considered analysis on this story of the day, really, we are joined in our studios in the capital by political analyst Professor Sibatefo. A very good morning to you, Prof. Thanks for being with us today. Professor, there's a lot of irony in this court because the MPA, who instated with Bulelani Ngcuka these charges in 2002, they're back in the court with the President today. The irony surely is not lost on you, I would think.
Oh yes, it is. It is indeed regrettable and unfortunate. I've heard on numerous occasions the head of state say, I would like to clear my name, I would like to have my day in court. But he has tried everything possible within the limits of the law to ensure that that day doesn't eventuate. And that's what is regrettable. And I hear people say, we are all equal before the law. Yes, indeed it is so. And it was the former head of state, Nelson Mandela, when challenged by Dr. Louis Late, and he said, yes, I will appear before the court. For as this nascent democracy is what it is, we must ensure that people believe in the rule of law and believe in the equality before the law. He set a good precedent, and I would have hoped that if the man was innocent, he would avail himself and let this matter be laid to rest once and for all.
How do you view the work of this Riti Commission, who exonerated the President of all these charges?
Well, I've never been a friend of the Riti Commission because the chairperson, Willie, the judge, was himself more in the news than what he was meant to do, to the extent that two of highly learned and respected guys, the lawyer and the judge president now of Mpumalanga, had to step down because they said there is a second agenda here perpetuated by the chairperson. I think that's enough. And the prosecutor also stepped aside. Those who were intended to submit evidence, they also said it is no longer worth it. And in the main, it had to do with the chairperson, unfortunately, and a highly learned legal jurisprudence scholar. But unfortunately, I suspect he will go down in the annals of history as one of those judges who failed to live up to the oath of the office.
It seems today as if there's a fracture between the judiciary and the executive at times. Is this part of the reason why we exist in this kind of climate today, you think?
Yesterday I was just talking to some people on some of these matters. You know, politicians are an interesting species indeed. If you recall what was going on in the Judicial Service Commission, there were learned scholars there, legal persons, who would try to run down other legal persons and sought to transform the judiciary in the sense they thought they wanted to. But now some of them are out of the job, they've been fired by the president. Some of them are aspiring for the headship of the state. But they now need the judiciary more than they needed it then, when they ought to have defended it, when political opportunism informed the less learned who were in the judiciary to try to hammer anybody and any judge who sought to stand by the oath he took then. But well and good, at least as the last line of defense, the judiciary did as proud, did as well, and I think they are gaining more respect across the political spectrum, across the color line. Even indeed those who denounce and renounce them yesterday, now they recognize and appreciate that we must respect them by all means possible.
Professor, let's talk about the current political situation in South Africa, because we're in a very interesting time. I think we can all agree we're heading into an elective conference, and some would say all is on the line a little bit at the moment. How do you view what is happening right now, and how do you expect what's happening in court today will play out in the months to come?
Oh yes, I really, my sympathies goes to the ruling party. 2 days ago, it was in Durban. I mean, that was a major blow to the body politic of the African National Congress. Today, here we are, it's also about the head of state. It cannot be good to the public image of the party that perpetually they are in court and almost every time they lose out. It cannot be correct for them. At least in the court of public opinion, I think they are losing out big deal. Now, that's one. The second thing says to me, what does it say to the unity that they want? Because there are factions. I'm sure there are those who are happy that this matter is going on because it will serve the interests of their faction, and there are others on the opposite side. Equally, even with the KwaZulu-Natal. But most importantly, the KwaZulu-Natal case also gave at least reason, belief, courage, and conviction that if you feel offended, go to the court and the court will pronounce in your favor if you so deserve. So I see more challenges, and there are already several court cases that you know that are coming from the branches. The list for the elective conference. So it is not a good time, and all these appearances in the court are not good for them.
Prof, thank you very much for joining us today. It looks like we're going to court a little bit earlier. Thank you for those views. That's Professor Lesiva Tefo. He's a political analyst coming to us live from the capital. That's Pretoria if you're watching in the Middle East or in the rest of Africa. Yes, it's still called Pretoria, in South Africa. But now we're going to go back to Bloemfontein because our reporter, Aldrin Sampier, is standing by with the spokesperson of the National Prosecuting Authority, Luvuyo Mfako. Very good morning to you once again, Aldrin. Just tell us, is the court starting a little bit earlier?
Well, yes, in the next couple of minutes, we're expecting the 5 justices to come through and the court proceedings will be getting underway. Let me just quickly, just before that moment of truth comes, let me just quickly bring in the NPA spokesperson, Luvuyo Mfako. Just a quick one, just for clarity's sake. The application from the NPA was first made to the Constitutional Court, and then the Constitutional Court then said, we won't listen to this matter now. Or we won't listen to this matter. And then this matter was, then the NPA then decided to bring it here. Just take us through the rationale around that.
We decided to expedite the matter, to take it straight to the ConCourt and not come to the SCA, because the issues that are raised are constitutional in nature. But the ConCourt, because the legal representatives of the president had petitioned already the SCA, and the ConCourt could not entertain the matter which would be entertained at the SCA, hence we had to come to the SCA. Our main purpose was to ensure that we ensure that the matter is finalized speedily.
And at the essence of that court application, and even here in the arguments that the NPA are making here, is the issue around the discretionary powers that that the NDPP has, that the NPA has, in terms of deciding when to prosecute and when not to prosecute. Let's just expand a bit on that.
That is the essence of our application. It's twofold. We're saying that the NPA has got a discretion to institute criminal proceedings as outlined in the Constitution, as well as to decide not to institute. In this matter, we're saying, in line with our policy directives, we are saying that our decision to stop the proceedings is based on solid factual basis, as enunciated in our policy directive, that a prosecutor who is tainted in terms of the processes, the prosecutorial processes, cannot actually take the matter to court. That is the principle that must be outlined today and be addressed by the SCA. Further, we are addressing the issue of separation of powers. Remember, the Pretoria court said the charges must be reinstated. We're saying that it is not for the court to instruct the NPA. It must just refer the matter back to the NPA for reconsideration.
And those are some of the issues that will be ventilated in court. I see that the justices have walked in and the proceedings are currently underway. Let's go straight into the courtroom.
Please, the court justices, I appear for the first respondent, the DA, together with Mr. Duval, Mr. Borgstrom and Mr. Vaquer.
Mr. Epstein, housekeeping matters first. What about? There is an application for condemnation which I understand the parties are agreed should be granted in relation to the filing of the record.
That is so, Madam.
No consequent orders, just the condemnation.
No consequent, no cost issue.
No cost. Is that agreed?
Well, yeah, that's agreed.
The Chambers voiced our collective displeasure at the state of the record before the core bundle was filed. We have all worked on the main record, and so our references will probably be in relation to the main record. But I do think that an apology should be forthcoming in relation to the state of the record, because it's repetitive, it's a bit chaotic.
Yes, well, justices may I unconditionally apologise for the state of the record. As an excuse, but not as a justification, we were granted leave after Zuma was granted leave, and we had to piggyback on the record which was being done. But it's not a justification. It should have been done, and we apologise.
Did you consult with Mr. Kemp at all in relation to the production of the record?
The State Attorney consulted with Mr. Kemp's attorneys in regard to the production, and in fact they called the compiler of the record, the services attending to it, called me from time to time.
Liability?
I think Mr. Kemp would. I didn't liaise with Mr. Kemp, but I tried my best with the transcribers.
Perhaps we should hear from him.
Justice Nafsa, on behalf of the applicant I represent, I apologise for the state of the record. It was a difficult task. It could have been done better. It should have been done better.
Yes, very well. Well, perhaps condemnation is granted in respect of the filing of the record. Perhaps we can now move to the minutes. And the other thing we agreed is that in relation to the application for leave and the merits, we'll argue all at once.
As the court pleases, we will argue that there are compelling reasons for granting leave to appeal, and that the prospects of success are not remote, but we of course have to first address the court on what those merits are.
An appropriate starting point would probably be, Mr. Epstein, the statement by Mr. Mshe.
Which is?
The statement by Mr. Mshe as to the
yes.
reasons, the needs.
Yes. Well, before I get there, I mean, we've...
You're going to have to speak up, Mr.
Yes.
Epstein. The acoustics aren't that good.
Yes. So we see the essence of this matter, and the central issue is whether the conduct of McCarthy was so egregious and the process so tainted that it was not in the public interest and the integrity of the criminal justice system to pursue the prosecution. And the question, therefore, is whether the decision taken by Mshe was rational. That, of course, is the central issue. Now,
for Justice, you, the chief protagonist is Mr. McCarthy.
Yes, he was. Justice Nafsa, I'd like to deal up front, if I may, but obviously according to your direction, with the issue in our additional heads, and that concerns the power used by Mshe when the decision was taken.
It's a convenient place to start, and I referred you earlier in Chambers to the decision of the Constitutional Court in the Liebenberg matter.
Yes. And Justice Nafsa, I've looked at the case, and it doesn't make the task easier in terms of distinguishing the present situation from the precedents and the cases.
Could I understand, perhaps we can agree on what the law is, and then we can look at the facts. As I understand it, if a decision maker refers to the wrong empowering statute, but in fact acted under the appropriate one, then the ensuing decision is not invalidated.
Yes, I think that's it.
Okay, so we agree on that. What the Constitutional Court seems to be saying in Liebenberg, and I know you sought to distinguish Harris, but Liebenberg in fact refers to Harris, does it not?
Yes.
Now, as I understand that, is if you mistakenly act under empowering statute X or the section of the Constitution X, when in fact you should be acting under Y, that does invalidate things. That seems to me to be...
Yes, that's the problem which I need to distinguish. It's a problem we've raised because the matter proceeded from inception on the basis that the decision was taken in terms of section 179(5)(d), which is a review, and we know that this court has said that a national director cannot review a national director. And in the papers it was said that McCarthy took the decision, but this court also said in 2009 that Mshe took the decision. So he could not review, and we accept that he could not have reviewed his own decision. But what he could have done is he could have reconsidered his decision. So there's a review where you review a deputy public prosecutor, that you do in terms of 179(5)(d). He was reviewing his own decision. He couldn't do that. We accept that. Well, but he could reconsider.
Could we just step back factually to what Mr. Hofmeyer's position is? Mr. Hofmeyer's position was the contrary to what you're putting now, isn't it? Mr. Hofmeyer's situation was we tried to keep him apart from the decision. So it was McCarthy who made the decision. And the reason we did so, let's not intrude upon the space of the multi-tiered nature of the decision. Let's leave that aside for the moment. But as I understand what Mr. Hofmeyer says is, he says McCarthy made the decision because we wanted to insulate Mr. Mshe, who later had to review. So that's the position he adopts, which basically must mean factually, and I think we all proceeded on that basis because Mr. Mshe makes, I think, a confirmatory affidavit, but yes. We all operate, everybody appears to have operated on the decision that it was a review of McCarthy's decision.
Yes, they did. But I'd like to accept and endorse what you say, Justice Nafsa. The problem is this, that in the 2009 decision, the review there was opposed on behalf of the NPA on the basis that Mshe could not have been reviewing a decision of Ngcuka or Picoli because they were national directors.
Are you talking about the decision by Justice Harms? Are you talking about the decision by Justice Harms?
Yes, that decision. Yes. So there the court finds it was a decision of Mshe, and there the court finds that he could not have reviewed a decision of another national director. And Hofmeyer says in his affidavit, clearly the decision was taken by Mshe in terms of 179(5)(d). He says that. I can't move away from that. So what then happens, he says, but in fact, although he ultimately took the decision, it was a corporate decision, which Mr. Downer called it, and they were all involved in taking the decision. And then, even if it is a corporate decision, he can't review his own decision. So, in fact, he then explains that it was McCarthy who was running with us. He was the lead prosecutor, and therefore McCarthy took the decision, and it could be reviewed.
Could we look at the permutations, the factual permutations? You're bound by what Justice Harum said, and I think that's the basis on which you did the supplementary heads. So that's the one immovable that you have. On Mr. Hofmeyer's position, well, McCarthy took the decision. Yeah. But at some stage, on the permutations, even as per Mr. Hofmeyer's affidavit, Mr. Mshe was party at some stage to a discussion.
Yes, that is so.
So isn't it dispositive and a real mountain for you to climb? Because if the law is as we agreed it is in Liebenberg, then if you're bound by what Justice Harum said, then Mr. Mshe was mistaken as to what he was doing, because the whole insulation submission by Mr. Hofmeyer is that he must have been thinking he was reviewing a decision of Mr. McCarthy. So factually, whatever the permutations are, you're in trouble.
Well, Justice Nafsa, that is so. I realized that when we were preparing for the case. That's why we put in the additional heads. It was my duty and incumbent upon me to inform the court of this difficulty. one leg has been cut off. I think I've got another leg to stand on, which may be an attempt to try and distinguish it. We've tried to distinguish Howick, and I would like to just try and distinguish Liebenberg if I can. The problem is this, that if I, at risk of repeating myself, the difficulty is this, or these are the possible permutations. Either Mshe reviewed a decision of McCarthy, which he was entitled to do, or it was a reconsideration in terms of 179.2, although he thought he was acting in terms of 179.5d. And the affidavits say that.
Sorry, Mr. You're going too quickly. Could you just repeat the last two submissions you were making?
So the only basis upon which Mshe could act in terms of section 179.5d was if he was reviewing a decision of McCarthy alone, not a corporate decision, because otherwise he was party to that decision. Now, in fact, the NPA advanced argument to this court in 2009 in the Harams DP decision, on which Justice Kachalia sat as well, that it was Mshe who took the decision. And that was central to that case, because in that case, Zuma was arguing that he was entitled to the benefits of section 179.5d because it was a review in terms of that section. And the court said it can't be. You cannot have an NDPP, Mshe, reviewing a decision of former NDPP.
Could I ask you this? As I understand the basis of your submissions in the supplementary heads, is that, and that's why you made them, because you considered yourself bound by what Justice Adams found, along with my brother Kachalia and 3 other members of this court. So you considered yourself bound by that decision.
Yes.
That's why you made it.
So.
Now, if that is so, and the submissions or the factual basis on which Mr. Hofmeyr says the decision was arrived at must mean that the decision is wanting for, particularly on the basis of what Liebenberg says. But you've got another problem, even on your permutation of it being a collective decision, which appears at some stage on Mr. Hofmeyr's to be, because Mr. Mshe attended the meetings, he was briefed, they had meetings with Mr. Downer, they had meetings with Mr. McCarthy. Even on that permutation, you have a difficulty with the Constitutional Court judgment.
In fact, it goes further against me, because the whole idea of that review is that to review, you give somebody who's applying for a review an objective view. Now, if he's taken the decision as part of a corporate decision, he could not be objective. Mr. Hofmeyr said at page 301 of volume 2, the NDP...
Sorry, just give us a second. 301.
301, paragraph 657.
Can you at the same time give me the core bundle reference, please? The core bundle reference.
Oh, the core bundle, that is the core bundle reference. So all my references
so
are
all your references to the core bundle.
Okay, well, now we've got a problem. If you give us the paragraph.
It's paragraph 657. 301. Volume 2 of the core bundle at 657.
657. Okay, I have that.
So this is Hofmeyr's affidavit. He says the NDPP's power to review a decision to prosecute is regulated by section 170, that's a typo, should be 179.5d of the Constitution, read with section 22.2c of the NPA Act. The scope of this power is explained in paragraph 75 to 77 above. The NPA respondents contend that Mshe acted in accordance with section 179.5d and section 22.2c of the NPA Act.
Well,
I can't move away from that.
Well, doesn't it go further against you in that if you look at what Mr. Hofmeyr said in respect of Mr. Piccoli's decision, he said, well, he couldn't make the decision. It should have been a decision of a DPP. So he bolsters it. I'm sorry to do this to you, Mr. Epstein, and you very correctly, as an officer of the court, made the concessions you've made. But isn't it dispositive? I mean, if for that reason the decision is tainted, then you don't have a decision to withdraw or to stay the prosecution or not to continue with it. Where does that take you? Then the only question is, subsequent to that, the only question then is whether, as you complain and as Mr. Kemp complains, you can't order the prosecution, and then that's a debate about whether or not the earlier decision remains extant. But aren't you bound, aren't you limited to that?
Well, I am subject to my trying in a moment, if I may, to distinguish it.
Sure.
If I can't distinguish it, if the court's against me on that, then I would have to ask for an adjournment to see if I can get an earlier flight.
Well, could I just say this to you? It's whether or not it is distinguishable.
Yes.
From Liebenberg.
That is so.
Okay. Very well. Make your best effort.
So if I may take you to our additional heads where we try to distinguish it.
I think it's where you refer to Harris, isn't it?
Yes. So we make the reference to Harris. The point about Harris is that in that case, the Minister of Education used a provision in an entirely different statute. He used a provision in the Policy Act, whereas it was only available to him in the Schools Act. And the Constitutional Court and Justice Sachs said, well, if you find your power in a particular statute and a particular act, you can't rely on another one simply because it is available to you. Now, there's reference in the Harris case to Latib and the decision of Gelgajay, and at paragraph 8 of our additional heads, we quote the relevant portion where Gelgajay said, "It seems clear, therefore, that where there is no direction in the statute requiring that the section in terms of which proclamation is made should be mentioned, then even though it is desirable, nevertheless there's no need to mention the section, and further that provided that the enabling statute grants the power to make the proclamation, the fact that it is said to be made under the wrong section will not invalidate the notice." And in the Howick District landowners matter, Cameron J. explained Latib as follows: when empowering statute does not require that the provision in terms of which a power is exercised is expressly specified, the decision maker need not mention it, provided, moreover, that the enabling statute grants the power sought to be exercised. The fact that the decision maker mentions the wrong provision does not invalidate the legislative or administrative act.
Well, could I ask you, whilst we're addressing that, to turn to paragraph 93 of the Liebenberg judgment? And I thought we'd agreed that this is the law, but let's just go through it a little more carefully. Before addressing the question, it is useful to make one observation. In our law, administrative functions performed in terms of incorrect provisions are invalid. That seems to me to be what we've agreed. Even if, and the same would apply, I would assume, to non-administrative actions, for example. The functionary is empowered to perform the function concerned by another provision. Even if, so, yeah, even if Mr. Mshe was entitled to do it under another provision, the fact that he purported to do it under one provision which wasn't the empowering of the proper provision would make it invalid.
Yes,
so far, so good.
No.
In accordance with this principle, where a functionary deliberately chooses a provision in terms of which it performs an administrative function, but it turns out that the chosen provision does not provide authority, the function cannot be saved from invalidity by the existence of authority in a different provision. Now, let me say this. You sought to distinguish Harris on the basis of different legislation. This is about provisions in one statute. At least that's the way it's spelled out. Am I correct in that?
You are, Justice Nathan.
Okay. Then 94 is the only thing that can come to your rescue. So let's look at it. The general rule admits of only one exception. This is where it is clear from the facts that the functionary had elected to rely on the correct provision, but mistakenly referred to an incorrect provision. Now, Mr. Epstein, with the best will in the world, aren't you hamstrung?
Yes, it's clear from the affidavit he intended to rely on 179.5d, quite clear. Perhaps the distinguishing factor is that he wasn't required and did not, when making the statement, state that he's making it in terms of 179.5d. So you've got a section of the Constitution, section 179, which gives powers of reconsideration. Prosecutors can reconsider their decisions, and there's a power to reconsider in terms of a review. Now, as a prosecutor, in terms of section 22.9, he, as notwithstanding he's the national director, can prosecute. He can then reconsider his own decision. So the question is whether in terms of 179, the function he was performing was the same. It was call it a review or reconsideration, but the function was the same.
Well, let me just understand this. We've agreed what the law is. On Mr. Hofmeyer's affidavit, can there be any doubt on your affidavit, your client's affidavit? And it's a yes or no answer, and this one can't avoid. Can there be any doubt on Mr. Hofmeyer's affidavit that what he was doing is he was reviewing Mr. McCarthy's decision?
On Hofmeyer's affidavit, Mshe was reviewing Mshe. He says so.
No, but doesn't he say he wanted to insulate because it was Mr. McCarthy's decision?
He says it's McCarthy's decision, but it's a corporate decision. He's party to that decision.
No, he says principally the person who made this decision, and he refers wrongly, he refers to the decision, to that email from Mr. Downer. Do you recall it? It's in the supplementary affidavit,
yes,
where he says, well, we discussed who should make the decision.
Yes.
And Mr. Downer then says, well, it's for the DSO to make the decision.
Yes.
And Mr. Hofmeyer, I'm afraid, is emphatic that that's the whole reason why they did it. And Mr. Hofmeyer contests this corporate decision, and I think as does Mr. Kemp's heads, that the DA relies upon.
He explains, he says it was blurred. Before, when the matter came before Harams J, he said it'd be blurred. He said it's unfortunate that it was mischaracterized. But he said it wasn't really Mshe's decision. It was he was part of a corporate decision. Well,
let's just be quite clear, because we're dealing with the affidavits here, and we have to have regard to both the affidavits and what was found in the 2009 decision, right? Now, there, Mshe and Hofmeyer deposed to affidavits where they said that the decision made was that of McCarthy and Mshe together. Correct?
Yes.
And it was on that basis that this court found that that Mshe had made that decision under purportedly under section 179.5. Right. What then happens is, in this case, contradictory affidavits are put up by the same people. And in these affidavits, they now seek to distance themselves from what they said under oath in the 2009 case. Because what is now being contended is that, in fact, the decision was McCarthy's, and that he manipulated Mshe.
Yes.
In fact, it goes further and says at the crucial time Mshe went on holiday.
Yes.
So the point of the matter is, here are people who deposed to affidavits, both Mr. Hofmeyer and Mr. Mshe, to contradictory affidavits, totally contradictory affidavits, in 2 hearings. Now, the question is this: that being so, and given the fact that the decision, the Harams decision in 2009 would have been before the decision makers when they made this decision, which is the subject matter of the present review, is that not an indication that that Mshe and whoever else made the decision, after deposing to these affidavits, absolutely were not applying their minds at all to the material before them? Surely they would have had to have looked at the very decision which has now come back in relation to the 27th, 28th December indictment. That's my problem. So even if you overcome the issue around whether they mistakenly used the power, the next question is whether they applied their minds at all, having regard to the fact that contradictory versions have been put up.
Well, Justice Kachalia, when the matter was realized in preparation for this, after our initial heads had been filed, because our initial heads relied on 179.5D, I took instructions from Mr. Sean Abrams. He said, regardless as to what has gone before, it doesn't matter. He wasn't party to it. He wants the correct position placed before the court.
Well,
and that's what we've done.
Could I just ask you to go to page 334 of the main bundle? I'm afraid I've worked on the main bundle. It's volume 3. Para 67. Let's start at para 67 and read.
I'm sorry, sir. That's the volume. CB3. Core bundle 3.
No, not core bundle. Main bundle.
And the main bundle.
Paragraph. Well, it's paragraph 67. If you can find Mr. Hofmeyer's affidavit, you go to paragraph 67. We're going to have to read 4 or 5 paragraphs together.
At the time of the Zuma prosecution. That's
right. So could we read it together? Because there are about 5 or 6 paragraphs in tandem that both impinge on the point that we were debating and that the issue raised by my brother Kachali. At the time of the Zuma prosecution, 2 people in the DSO had the necessary authority to institute the prosecution. The first was McCarthy. This has got to be seen before I go on against his attitude that Piccoli couldn't institute the prosecution. The first was McCarthy, the head of the DSA. The second was Mgengu. So he's saying those are the only 2 people who could institute the prosecution. The investigating director responsible for the prosecution. Mshe had no power to make the decision to prosecute Zuma, nor did he purport to do so. Okay? Next paragraph. I need to point out that in the previous litigation, which is what my brother referred to, the question had been blurred. I draw this court's attention to paragraphs 92 and 93 of Deploy's affidavit. This affidavit was made pursuant to an application by Zuma to set aside the 2007 decision to charge him. Zuma claimed that the decision was invalid because he was not given an opportunity to make representations. Then he goes on to what Deploy said. And Deploy said, at the end of para 92 of Deploy's affidavit, if you turn to the next page, which is my page 335, do you have that?
I've got I'm in Deploy's affidavit.
Yes. So it's para 92 of Deploy's affidavit. He says, this process of drafting, consultation and assessment was completed by 11th December, whereupon Mr. Mshe and Mr. McCarthy considered the matter as a whole with a view to taking a decision on prosecution. This is what Mr. Hofmeyer says on the next page, para 69.
But before that, if I can interrupt for a moment,
yes.
At the bottom of 93 of Deploy's affidavit says, Mr. Mshe accordingly issued the instruction to the prosecution team to reinstitute the charges without delay.
So he's saying Mshe is directing matters.
Yes.
All right. The next paragraph, which is paragraph 69, says, this is not an accurate record of what happened. This is Mr. Hofmeyer. These are your papers. It is correct that McCarthy, accompanied by the prosecution team, met with Mshe to consider the NPA's response to the SCA decision. However, what is not recorded is that Mshe made it clear that all decisions about the prosecution should be left to the DSO. And it also is not correct that Mshe made the decision to institute the prosecution on the 27th. And as my brother pointed out, Mshe was on leave at the time. It was McCarthy who decided it should be done before the end of 2007. Now, Mr. Epstein, you said before that very correctly Mr. Abrams said, well, let the cards fall where they may, we've got to adopt the correct position. Well, you did indicate earlier that you might want to take an instruction on where you go with what we had. Now, on this particular issue, I think you acknowledged right at the beginning it's a very steep hill for you to ascend. Is that correct?
Yes, Justice Nafsa. In fact, on that basis, it would be a procedurally irrational. If not substantively irrational, then it's procedurally rational.
Well,
it may well go to substantive irrationality as well, because if contradictory versions are put up, then it goes to the heart of the very decision that was made, not merely the procedure that was adopted. The material before the people who are putting up affidavits or the people who are making the final decision now must include perforce Deploy's affidavit, the Harem's judgment. All of those matters are before the decision maker. So is it merely procedural irrationality, or does it deal Does it go directly to the question of the state of mind of the decision maker?
Well, the basis of the decision is that the conduct of McCarthy was so egregious and so tainted the process that it did not allow for a continuation of the prosecution. And so that fact, whether it was a reconsideration or whether it's a review, that fact wouldn't change. They were still acting in terms of a consideration of how egregious is this, what kind of interference is this, and what manipulation is this.
Well, but as I understand it, on the debate we've been having up until now, and very technically, because you've always been proper technically, Mr. Epstein, if I might compliment you on that, I don't know how you get past the first point. I don't know how you even get, I mean, it is substantive because that's what the judgment of Jafta J in the Constitutional Court says. It transcends into a substantive point. It has a substantive effect. If you purported to exercise a power X, when in fact that wasn't the power you had, isn't that the end of the matter, substantively? I'm putting that to you, and no. I think the answer is yes or no.
Justice Navsa, I feared so. All I could try to do was to try to distinguish the case from the present one. And I know it's a difficult climb. The Liebenberg case is pretty clear. The only argument I could submit is that it's a reconsideration. They're applying their minds in terms of the same section, whether they're doing the 179(5)(d), where they would have been entitled to get representations, or whether they're doing it as a prosecutorial reconsideration. The facts that they have to apply their minds to would be the same.
But let me put you finally, and perhaps we must now draw this part to a close, and I mean, you might want to take an instruction on it, because I think on the facts you have a difficulty. So the distinguishing is one thing, but the facts, I don't know if the facts give you any room for maneuver. But Mr. Hofmeyer adopts the position, and he's adopted consistently, that he was concerned about legality, he was concerned about propriety. He says that repeatedly. Now, if he's concerned about that, and he does this on behalf of your clients, then you must be as concerned as you are now about the matters that you raise pertinently in relation to the supplementary heads. And therefore, for consistency, you would expect that they would say, okay, this is a mess. We're sorry we made a mistake.
Well, Justice Navsa, I'll have to rest my case there. It's taken 8 years to get here. It's been a long journey, and I'd like to address you then on what happens. Does it go back for a decision in terms of the rights provision?
Well, can I ask you this? Are you now giving up the ghost in relation to the correctness of, well, you now, given what your supplementary heads did, given the debate that we've had, having regard to Liebenberg, are you accepting that you are now left? Mr. Kemp may adopt a different position, that's neither here nor there, but all that's left to you is that you've now got to persuade us that the court below, when it said charges will have to be faced, was entering upon the terrain of another arm of government.
Yes.
Is that
that is other? Justice Navsa, it's quite clear to the justices and to everyone that there is this difficulty. If you're asking me to concede it, I'd like to advance the argument I have, for whatever merit it may have, to distinguish it and leave it.
You don't say that with much conviction, Mr. Epstein.
Well, not with much conviction, but the cases are difficult. Justice Sachs said in the Harris case, the applicability of this line of reasoning must depend on the particular facts of each case. And perhaps the facts in this case are somewhat different, because it's the same decision and the same provision. But if you'd allow me to leave it there.
There you
go. Mr. Epstein, because Mr. Kemp still has to come, and the DA still has to argue, I want to explore another problem with you, and that is assuming you overcome the 179 problem. You're then faced with as I understand your case, it's this. It's not the decision to prosecute that was contaminated. It was the decision when to serve the indictment that was contaminated. Correct?
Correct.
Now, this court ruled and held emphatically in the 2009 case that the motive for the prosecution is irrelevant. If the prosecution is brought even for an improper purpose, provided that its principal purpose, the principal purpose of the prosecution is to secure a conviction of an accused, whatever other extraneous factors may operate are really irrelevant. That was the clear finding in this court. Now, I struggle to understand that if that is, as we stated the law then, how it can possibly argue that the prosecution isn't contaminated when the decision is not attacked, but merely the date when the indictment is going to be served is attacked. That I have great difficulty with.
Justice Kachalia, let me make one aspect clear. Perhaps I should have said it at the outset. There is no contention on behalf of the NDPP that...
Speak up, please, Mr.
There is no contention on behalf of the NPP that there, in regard to the merits, that there is not, if not a strong case, at least a prima facie case against Zuma. That's never been the contention in this matter. Nor has it ever been the contention that Mr. Zuma would not receive a fair trial. The only contention is that when you have conduct of the prosecutor who's running the process, and that conduct is so egregious, it is so manipulative, and the purpose is to manipulate the outcome of not an ordinary election, but an election as to who would become the president of this country, then the court says that abuse cannot be tolerated. The message which must be sent out to the public is that anybody who is prosecuted will be prosecuted fairly and without an ulterior motive, which is different, Justice Kachalia, from the ill motive which you spoke about. You can prosecute somebody with an ill motive. It doesn't make the case bad. And you can prosecute somebody with a good motive. It doesn't make the case good. But there's an ulterior, if there's an ulterior motive, and this was the ulterior motive, to take the prosecution process, which was ongoing, in progress, and to take that and to now stop it and to use it to manipulate who would become the president of the country.
The process culminating in the decision to prosecute was over.
That was over.
That was over by the end of November. Between the beginning of December and, let's call it Polokwane, which was the 16th of December, they were getting authorization under POCA, they were finalizing the indictment. So the decision had been made, assuming in your favor that the abuse is established, and if we have to go there, we'll have to debate the facts with you as to whether in fact that was established. But assuming in your favor, for present purposes, that it's established, all that is established was that somebody interfered with the served. It had nothing to do with the decision to prosecute.
It is accepted. Downer said, when he listened to the tapes and he heard what was going on, he said he was reduced to tears, but he still wanted to carry on with the case. Now the question is, even though there is the decision to prosecute at the time is not tainted, if during a prosecutorial process it is established that there have been shenanigans, for want of another description,
no, but all
that people have misbehaved.
The process was over. The prosecutorial process was over. It was in the crossing of the T's and the dotting of the I's, the date when they were going to formally serve the indictment, that there was a debate whether this should happen before Polokwane or after Polokwane. And I'm saying to you, what I'm putting to you is simply this, that assuming in your favor that some people, including Mr. McCarthy, had bad motives for delaying it till afterwards. And I must tell you on the facts, Mshe also had that view after having spoken with Minister Mabandla. So there was a confluence of ideas and views on that matter. But let's leave that aside. I say again, assuming in your favor, the process was over at the end of November. So your argument must be that the mere serving of the indictment for a bad motive, in this case, was good enough to nullify the entire prosecution. That must be your argument. And what I'm putting to you simply is this: in the light of our judgment in 2009, on what basis can you possibly advance that submission?
Justice Charlie, I think the conduct it shouldn't be minimized. I mean,
before you answer that, can I just put my problem to you, as my learned brothers put to you? The decision had been taken to prosecute. Mr. Sheikh had been convicted. There'd been a finding of some relationship between Mr. Zuma and Mr. Sheikh. There were now a few additional charges that were being considered and were included ultimately in the charge sheet. So the decision to prosecute had been taken. And then, what difference can it make as to when, in that regard, as to when the indictment is actually served? Because once you've taken the decision to prosecute, there's no abuse thereafter of the prosecutorial process. It's not a question of you are prosecuting someone for an improper purpose. That decision had already been taken, and that's the essential difficulty that I have, that I share with this whole thing, as to why, when you find out that there's been some discussion with people that maybe there shouldn't have been a discussion with, this should so embarrass the prosecutorial authorities that the prosecution should be withdrawn.
Well, Justice Leach, can I answer first by looking at how serious was this conduct? And there are three passages I would like to refer to. The first is that the DA, in its own papers, and right at the very beginning in Court Bundle 1, at page 94, these are their founding papers.
So is this Mr. Self's?
This is Mr. Self's affidavit.
Is that should be in volume 1 of the manual?
Volume 1 at paragraph 94.
94, you said?
Paragraph 94, Justice Chairman. Now, Mr. Self says, to the degree that Mr. McCarthy was a party to manipulating the timing of exactly when Mr. Zuma was to be recharged, that is to say, whether this should occur before or after the ANC's national conference held in Polokwane during December 2007, this was plainly most irregular and worthy of strong criticism. In the next paragraph 96, he says, in the fourth line, again, the irregularity of Mr. McCarthy's conduct is not to be minimized.
No, but go back to para 95. Para 95 is what my two brothers have been putting to you. Read para 95.
That deals with improper motive.
Well, no. However, in the context of the matter as a whole, the absence of any proper tainting the decision to charge and to recharge that had been conducted by a committed and dedicated team of prosecutors. But as you rightly pointed out, if you go to page 121 of volume 1, this is what you pointed out. Page 121.
Paragraph, Justice.
Well, page 121 is the statement by Mr. Mshe in volume 1. So if you look at the statement by Mr. Mshe, which sets out why he chose.
Yes, I have that, Justice.
Well, in the middle, under background, in the middle of that page, more or less line 12, 13, the representations submitted pertain to the following issues: the substantive merits, the fair trial defences, the practical implications and consideration of continued prosecution, the policy aspects. And then he says, I need to state up front that we could not find anything with regard to the first three. So the substantive merits, I think you indicated, you considered was good.
Yeah.
Mr. Downer was particularly strong in his memorandum about that. The fair trial defences, he says, well, that won't impinge. The practical implications of continued prosecution, he doesn't think that will infringe. And he really does it on the basis of policy, and it's really about McCarthy relating to the timing. So if you go to all of the cases that we were referred to, the foreign jurisdiction cases, particularly the English cases, those really impinged on fair trial considerations and irregularities. But again, it's a trial judge's discretion, is it not, in weighing up those interests? Or it may be a court approached on the issue.
Well, it may be that the NDPP doesn't have to go to court, which is our argument. He has that power.
No, but we're not talking about the NDPP going to court. But if a court has to decide these issues, as I understand the English authorities and the dicta that were referred to, whether it's Latip or any one of the others, and what they say is whether or not that conduct should be considered as one that calls an end to the prosecution, what has to be weighed up is the conduct as against the public interest considerations, and that is within the discretion of a court. Yeah. That's correct, isn't it?
That is correct.
Well, in this case, what you're ultimately putting to us, as my two brothers have put to you, is that notwithstanding that the merits are good, notwithstanding that Mr. Mshe himself says the prosecution itself wasn't tainted, as in there was no fiddling with the evidence, there was no investigation that was achieved by coercive, or information that was achieved by coercive methods. All you're left with, and that is debatable on the papers about the timing and who was responsible for the timing. But let's assume for the moment that Mr. McCarthy wanted to have a particular timing. How does that make the prosecution a bad one?
So, if I may respond this way, Justice Nafsa. So we know what the conduct was. We know what McCarthy was doing. He was trying to delay it, and we must accept that he was trying to delay it because there was concern that if the indictment was served before Polokwane, it may boomerang in the sense that people may rally around Zuma and President Mbeki would not get re-elected. So that is the conduct. Now, the court said
Mr. Epstein,
in the judgment.
Before you proceed, can you fact check this in your response? When did Mr. Mshe finalize the authorization of the poker and of the institution of poker proceedings? Didn't he finalize it around December?
Well, the decision to prosecute was taken, I think, 29 November, but I'm a little off guard. I don't know the date of the poker.
But when did he sign?
Was it the 12th of December, 11th or 12th of December?
Yes.
Yes, I think that my memory serves. I think you jogged my memory.
Perhaps you can look at the chronology.
Yes. So the court said, in our view, this is in the judgment at paragraph 52 of the quota quo. In our view, the alleged conduct of Mr. McCarthy, as appears from the transcript of the recorded conversations, if proven, constitutes a serious breach of the law and prosecutorial policy. It is not even necessary to refer to his role in the Browse-Moll report, for which it seems he was not admonished. His conduct, as alleged in the transcript, again, if proven, certainly calls for intervention. This will involve an inquiry into the allegations, and if need be, also censure by court of law. So the courts found that this conduct was a serious manipulation. It constituted a serious breach of the law, and the DA believed also it was conduct. They say
manipulation of what, Mr. Epstein? What is the manipulation?
So, Justin, if I could just get there, if I could just have a moment. So, the court criticizes the conduct. They say, if proven, we submitted. It was the NDPP's discretion to take into account what he had. He didn't have to go to court to prove it, notwithstanding the court said that it should have been taken to court. So what do we have? What is the essence? What did he do? McCarthy was in a position to have the indictment served. Downer wants to proceed. Downer wants to proceed
but
because...
when was it finalized? When was the indictment itself finalized?
Justice Chiki, the decision was taken 29 November to prosecute. I think poker was round about 12 December, and the indictment was served, I think, just after Polokwane, 28, 27, 28. Poker was signed 14 December 07, just before Polokwane.
Just before Polokwane. Yes. But its actual finalized, when was it ready for it to be served on Mr. Zuma? Because my sense of the papers is that if we put aside the debate on when it should have been served, whether it should have been served before Polokwane or after Polokwane, the point, well, my sense of the papers is that it was in any event ready only after Polokwane.
I think, Justice Chiki, the certificate, the indictment can be served without a certificate. The poker certificate only has to be available at trial, provided the party hasn't pleaded. So whether they were waiting for the poker certificate, I'm not sure, but they certainly, Mr. Dana was very upset when he was told that it would be postponed, and he made a lot of noise about that. He made it clear that he didn't want it postponed, and this was the egregious conduct.
What has been put to you by my colleague is the following, that objectively on the facts, because there was a few things had to be done before Polokwane, that whether or not there was manipulation was overtaken by events, because the indictment was only ready for service on or about the 14th of December. Nobody was going to, over a long weekend, start serving indictments. So whether or not there was manipulation, in fact, the indictment could only be served after Polokwane, which means that to the extent that there was manipulation, it is in any event irrelevant because it had no bearing on the ultimate timing. That's as I understand
Justice Kachai, I think with respect, we see from the transcripts that Bulalani Ngcuka was saying to McCarthy, whatever you do, don't serve this weekend, just before Polokwane. So on that basis, McCarthy must have known the indictment was ready to be served. But I haven't finished my submission as to why this was an abuse of such a nature that it was not in the interest of the public interest to continue.
No, but what's being put to you is whether in fact it was an abuse, and whether it had an effect. If you have regard to the fact, let's just recount the facts. Minister Mabandla herself was concerned about the timing, was she not?
But for a completely different reason to that of McCarthy.
No, but be that as it may, even if you bring in Mr. Casserols at one stage, and what you make of him is a different question. But he too had similar concerns about what the effect might be. What the effect of serving before Polokwane in the light of heated political emotions.
But they were concerned that the effect might be that there would be problems within the country, as opposed to McCarthy's concern, which was that President Mbeki would not be re-elected. So he was prepared to delay the indictment for a valid reason, but it turns out that he was persuaded, whereas for the wrong reason. And McCarthy had his own agenda. And when he found that out with the tape recordings, when he found that out, and then he took into account McCarthy's history with Browse Mole, he realized what he was doing and what he was up to.
Okay. Could I just understand that as far as you're concerned, whatever the objective factors might be, whatever Minister Mabandla's concerns might have been, whatever anybody else might have thought who had legitimate cause to think that timing was a problem, because who knows what might happen in respect of instability, because that I think was the legitimate concern, was that not? National instability.
Well, that was Minister Mabandla's concern, and that was why Michelle was prepared to postpone.
But if you add what my sister Chiki put to you, to the question of they'd already had Justice Msimang being angry at proceeding without all the formalities being in place in the past. So in terms of whether the racketeering charges and the certificate was obtained properly, it was probably imperative to ensure that it was all in place before the indictment got served. Are we?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, if that is so, then how is the prosecutorial process? And that's the difficulty I have, that it's the prosecution itself. When you serve the indictment or how you serve it How does that impinge on a case, and maybe in respect of Latif and all of those cases, and if you look at pages 130 to 131 of Mr. Mshe's statement, he doesn't seem to do that weighing up process. He doesn't say to himself, well, hang on, how much of this, if we're talking rationality, how much of this, having discounted the three other factors, which is fair trial rights, having discounted the question of how you mount the defense, he says none of those impinge. He says, but it offends against one's sense of justice. Following the Latif and the other cases in the UK, the public interest ought to have been weighed up as well. Is that not correct?
Well, but that is what he said he did. He said, I accept the merits were good. I accept he would still get a fair trial. But in terms of Maxwell, there are two categories where you can stay a prosecution. The one is where you don't get a fair trial, and the other way is where you have an abuse of this type, and you can stay the prosecution because the court won't countenance any kind of abuse that reflects not only on the integrity of the criminal justice system, but also on the integrity of the court.
Could we go to page 117 of Maxwell, where there's a reference to Latif?
Is this
it's in the bundle of documents. It's in the bundle of cases and articles.
We deal with it in our heads, Justin. That's that paragraph 69 of Maxwell. Just find one.
Well, let's read it because it's important in this weighing up process, and the concerns raised by my brothers Leach and Kachalia, as well as by my sister Chiki, all come into it. The law is settled, says what Lord Steyn said in Latif. Weighing countervailing considerations of policy and justice, it is for the judge, in the exercise of his discretion, to decide whether there has been an abuse of process, which amounts to an affront to the public conscience and requires the criminal proceedings to be stayed. But what's important is the latter part of that quote. But it is possible to say, that's really at the end of that quote, that in a case such as the present, the judge must weigh in the balance the public interest in ensuring that those that are charged with grave crimes should be tried, and the competing public interest in not conveying the impression that the court will adopt the approach that the end justifies the means. So we must agree that that's what goes into the pot.
Yes, and in Mshe's statement, he plagiarized this, what he said from here.
Yes, accepting, but I'm not sure he followed it to the letter, because he doesn't, where does he deal with the graveness of the offense in relation to the other public interest? Does he do that in the statement, Mr.?
Well, he does. He hasn't summarized his entire analysis, but he said, I took it into account.
But let me tell you about this plagiarism to which you refer, because that too goes to his state of mind. Here you have a director of prosecutions who plagiarizes some other judgment. All right? That judgment refers to an abuse of process. Abuse of process, as we know in our law and as we know in foreign jurisdictions, an abuse of process refers to an abuse of the court process. On appeal, that very judgment that he plagiarized makes that clear. It sets the judgment aside which he relies on. That is not disclosed to the court. So what he does is he invokes an abuse of process doctrine quite inappropriately. I'm prepared to accept that there may be cases of an egregious abuse of power by a prosecutor which may well warrant a prosecutor deciding that because of this abuse of power, I am going to stop the prosecution. I can accept that. But what he does is he invokes the wrong doctrine. The doctrine abuse of process deals with permanent stays. What I'm putting to you, therefore, is this. That is another indication of a man operating with at least no idea of what he's doing, or alternatively, not applying his mind at all to what he's doing. But with great respect, those reasons are nonsense.
Justice Kachalia, he referred to Maxwell. Maxwell said there are two categories. Where it will be, it is well established, says Maxwell, that the court has the power to stay proceedings in two categories.
You're going back. If you don't want to answer the question, you don't have to answer it. But I need some clarity on this. What I'm saying is those judgments refer to an abuse of process doctrine, abuse of a court process. It's a different situation. He cannot invoke a process unless he says, I'm invoking this as a comparison between what I'm about to do and the way the courts have approached in foreign jurisdictions the abuse of process in permanent stays. Then I can understand what he's doing, but that's not what he's doing. So that's what I'm putting to you, that he's barking up absolutely the wrong tree.
And I certainly will answer it, Justice Kachali.
Yes.
I won't avoid the question. I refer to Maxwell, and I want to first quote from what Maxwell says. It is well established that the court has the power to stay proceedings in two categories of case, namely, one where it is impossible to give the accused a fair trial. I said that's not the case here. Two, where it offends the court's sense of justice and propriety to be asked to try the accused in the particular circumstances of the case. In the first category of case, if the court concludes that an accused cannot receive a fair trial, it will stay the proceedings without more. No question of the balancing of competing interests arises. In the second category of case...
Can we stop there? We're not in that category.
We're not in that category.
Okay.
In the second category of case, the court is concerned to protect the integrity of the criminal justice system. So if I can just have a moment to again say what happened. Downer was very concerned about not serving the indictment. The matter had already been struck off the roll by Msimangche. He was concerned about a permanent stay application. He didn't want this to happen again. And he in fact wasn't being told the truth, Downer, about what was happening. He was intent that the indictment should be served. And you've got the head prosecutor who is holding back with the indictment because Polokwane's come up and he's not running the prosecutorial process as he should with anybody else. He's keeping it in abeyance for one reason only, and that is to satisfy his own personal interest that his champion, President Mbeki, should remain the president of the ANC and become the president of the, remain the president of the country. Now that is the conduct. Can I add to that, Justice Kacharia? If one accepts that is the conduct, which with respect must be the case, if that conduct is serious, if it's egregious, as the DA themselves thought, as the court felt, then what it comes down to, it comes to rationality. And Justice Kachalia, in a recent decision which you gave in the Free State University matter and FE Forum, you said, when you look at the facts, once there is conduct, it falls within the discretion of the decision maker to decide how serious that conduct is. It's his, and how much weight to be given to that conduct. And it's not for me and it's not for the court. The court might well have done something different. The court might well think it's unreasonable. But the cases are replete with statements to the effect, whether it's Batterstar, pharmaceuticals. The fact is this court cannot look at it as what this court would have done. Lots of people here might have taken a different view, but it's not for us to second guess that. If this power is given to him in terms of the Constitution, he exercised that discretion. One doesn't like it. Can I just make? I want to try and make the point and I think I can make with this last reference. Corner House. The Corner House case which we refer to, there you had a situation where the investigating director in England was investigating possible corruption between the Saudi Arabians and an arms supplier. And what happened there is the Saudi Arabians, it was extortion. They said, if you carry on this investigation, if you carry on looking at accounts in Switzerland, we won't buy typhoons from you, we won't cooperate with security, and we won't buy further arms from you. And he succumbs to that extortion. And the House of Lords says, as long as he's in good faith, it's his discretion. And lots of people were very, very unhappy about that, understandably so.
Are you suggesting that we would follow the same route if a similar set of, that our constitutional court would follow the same route?
No, I'm not. What I'm saying, what the constitutional court will say is, as unfortunate as it is, we cannot impede upon the discretion given to a decision maker in these circumstances.
Could we just wrap up the principles in relation to Maxwell, and it's in relation to what you read. You read from paragraph 13. You read about the two categories. And really, as my brother pointed out, this was in relation to an application for a permanent stay of proceedings, or at least in relation to a permanent stay of proceedings. Can we accept that that's the context in which it was?
Yes.
A number of those cases deal with police conduct, prosecutorial conduct in relation to witnesses and the like. It's manipulating the evidence and the process in relation to the prosecution, because it's under the heading prosecutorial misconduct. So far, so good.
Yes.
In relation to the second category, which is where we're not talking about fair trial rights, but we're talking about, and this is what it says at the end of 113, no question of the balancing of competing interests arises, but in the second category it does. The court is concerned to protect the integrity of the criminal justice system. That's what the second category is about. And then there's that last part in Latif, which is, but it is possible to say, and that's where the weighing up gets done. And the weighing up that gets done is not only that the public interest ensuring that those are charged with grave crimes. That's the second part that has to be weighed. That's not done by Mr. Mshe in his statement. I think you have to concede.
I do concede it. In fact, he concedes it because he says the merits don't come into play. The merits are good. The prosecutors think the merits are good, so he must have taken it into account. He must have weighed it up. He says the merits are good.
He doesn't say I've done that weighing, and in doing the weighing, I come down on side X rather than side Y. Where does he say that? Because that's what Maxim says you've got to do.
Where's the statement? Where's the statement? Mine's highlighted. So if I can just have a moment to find the share statement, which I've got here that I've highlighted.
It's at page 130, 131 of volume 1. So if you take the main bundle, you get it at page 130, 131.
So, as you read out earlier, Justice Nafsa, he said the representation submitted by the legal representative pertain to the following issues, and the first one is the merits. And then he says, I need not say up front, we could not find anything with regard to the first three grounds. So we accept, he knows the merits are good. In fact, he ends off by saying that, by recording that the prosecutors, he says, let me also state for the record that the prosecution team itself had recommended that the prosecution should continue, even if the allegations are true.
Well, can I tell you what is fatal to the argument you're making now? Just look at page 130. Let's go through it very carefully, because we've got to debate it conceptually in relation to the Maxim test, which I think you have to accept is the test. You propound it as the test. McCarthy, it's line 34 of page 130. Are you there? Look at page 130. It's
is it after background, Jessica? 1102. Which is from yours?
Could you just read it very carefully, where it says Mr. McCarthy used the legal process?
Yes.
It says Mr. McCarthy used the legal process for a purpose other than which the purpose was designed to serve. That is, for collateral and illicit purposes. Let's just accept that for the purposes of the argument. It does not matter. So he says it does not matter that the team acted properly, honestly, fairly, and justly throughout. Mr. McCarthy's conduct amounts to a serious abuse of process and offends one's sense of justice. Well, as Maxim tells us, it does matter. It does matter because it's the gravity of the offense and the process itself. What Mr. McCarthy did was not simply being over-diligent, it was pure abuse of process. Well, we know abuse of process has to be weighed up. That's what Maxim tells us. Go to the next page. If Mr. McCarthy's conduct offends one's sense of justice, it would be unfair as well as unjust to continue with the prosecution. He doesn't say, I've weighed the public interest in relation to the gravamen of the charges and in relation to the fact that it has to be weighed up. He says, I'm just putting one thing on the scale, and that's my conclusion.
Yes.
Well, am I wrong in that, Mr.
Well, Justice Nafsa, I think, with respect, that when he says, I concede the merits are good, the prosecutors want to carry on, he has taken into account there are strong merits in this case. And when he looks at the abuse of process, and he says, but the abuse is so egregious, and I'm going to make a finding to stay, it must mean that he says, notwithstanding good merits.
No, this is what Maxim tells us. This is what Lord Steyn tells us to do. Must weigh in the balance, the public interest in ensuring that those that are charged with grave crimes should be tried. That's the one part. The other one is competing public interest in not conveying the impression that the court will adopt the approach that the end justifies the means. All he does is he takes the second into account. Where does he ever say, I've had regard to the public interest that those charged with grave crimes should be tried? Where does he say that? Where at all in that statement? That might bring us to another point. We've got here Mr. Mshe is the central figure in all of this, isn't he?
Yes.
I mean, he's the central figure. Why is there no statement by me? Why is there no affidavit by Mr. Mshe other than a confirmatory? Shouldn't we be expecting that the central figure in this entire drama should be telling us what motivated him, what he considered, and that whole question about what he said to Downer, whether he, according to Mr. Hofmeyer, he told Mr. Downer one thing, but it wasn't the truth. It was an untruth. Why don't we have Mr. Mshe on affidavit telling us what he did, what he considered, how he dealt with Mr. Downer, and how he dealt with all of these others?
Just Nafsa, there's a supplement. There is a supplementary confirmatory by him.
Yes, that's.
I think there's two affidavits.
Well,
there's that one, and then there's
take us to it.
Got it in core bundle at volume 4, page 619. Must say while I'm looking for it, Justice Nafsa, that whilst there are conflicts in the affidavits, I had no hand in drafting them. Just want to mention that for the record.
Sorry?
I just want to mention that for the record.
We won't direct that accusation at you.
I think it's wise that you seek that shelter. In certain respects, this affidavit from Mr. Hofmeyer is scandalous.
Well, it is.
Unsubstantiated allegations, political statements of fact, unsubstantiated by the facts. Anybody has to be condemned, it's Mr. Hofmeyer.
Yes. And hence I wanted to place on record my
Well,
lack
perhaps
of
you should
involvement.
tell us why you're distancing yourself from the affidavit, because there must be something in the affidavit you're referring to us, referring us to now, that where the shoe will pinch. Now, what is it?
No. Oh, that's coming now?
Yeah.
Oh, no. I don't think it gets worse. But let me just find that supplementary.
No, but you'll find, why are you looking for the affidavit? What my colleague presiding is putting to you is this. You see, what is involved here is a process of rational decision-making on the part of the National Director of Public Prosecutions. What happens here is that Mr. Hofmeyer puts up this lengthy, convoluted affidavit, in many cases makes allegations, draws inferences, makes allegations that are unsubstantiated. Mr. Mshe, we're trying to investigate Mr. Mshe's state of mind. He merely puts up a confirmatory affidavit on the critical aspects and says, yes, now everything that Mr. Nuka says, that Mr. Hofmeyer says, including the fact that I was being manipulated by McCarthy, I confirm all of that. That's what he does. In 3 lines, he confirms it. And so what is being put to you is that when it is Mr. Mshe's state of mind that is being investigated and the reasons he gave, surely one expects the principal answering affidavit to be made by him, not a supplementary affidavit where he then seeks to clarify matters where he missed out on the first bite of the cherry. That's what's being put to you.
No, with respect, I wouldn't take issue with that.
Well, could I put something else?
But the affidavit, there is a...
I have found the affidavit. Yeah. I'll tell you where it pinches, really pinches, Mr. Epstein, page 630. So it's before that. At some stage, sorry, I picked it up a minute ago and I've now lost it.
52?
But no, he says, he does deal with Downer, persuading us necessary, therefore they have to support the decision. He does talk about the decision to, he says at some stage, I'm sorry, I missed it now, but it is...
A corporate decision is...
No, it wasn't a corporate decision. He said it was the DSO's decision. It wasn't mine.
41, perhaps. We were particularly uncomfortable that in several affidavits in the past, decision had been described as that of the NDPP without any qualification.
Yeah, and then he says quite emphatically at some stage, and this takes us back to the first point. He says, well, that decision was made by the DSO. It was all up to McCarthy. And that gives you difficulty on the first point we debated, doesn't it?
That does. That is, and I refer to him having said that it is mischaracterized in paragraph 52.
Well, exactly.
That's
exactly.
Perhaps that is putting it.
Yeah, I mean that almost completely. Doesn't that just stultify your attempt to distinguish? That, I'm afraid, is a yes or no answer, Mr. Webster.
Well, Justice Nafsa, it cannot be that he says that it's unfortunate that it was previously characterized in a particular way. I've raised that. He cannot say that. The fact of this, we're back to the first point, is that he made a decision. He used the wrong section. The only question is whether he could have used another section.
No, but my brother Kachalia pointed out to you, nobody seems to know who made the decision. I mean, one person says it was so-and-so, then they say perhaps it was a corporate decision, perhaps it was, then somebody says that it was a DSO.
But when we put in these additional heads, I proceeded on the basis, the one basis that everyone is bound by, and that is the SCA's decision in 2009 that it was Mshe's decision. And you can say that it's a corporate decision. The fact is that that was what was advanced to the SCA by the NPA in 2009, that it was Mshe's decision, and that's what the court found.
Yeah.
There's
yes,
only one aspect that I've
sorry,
got
I think it's much earlier than that. You may want to consider it. It may be an appropriate time to take the adjournment. But it is page 624, at the end of it, there's a discussion about Downer's involvement. And then 625, page 30. He does talk about the collaborative approach, but he does say he made the decision independently, McCarthy, 28. McCarthy decided to institute the prosecution. McCarthy told Downer to finalize them. He knew that he had the power to do so, and he did. I mean, how do you get by it on your own affidavits? Mr. Epstein, perhaps you can take the tea adjournment to consider it, and we'll see.
Well, he says earlier on page 627, in accordance with all the above, the investigating director, director of special operations, in consultation with the head DSO, me and the other deputy acting, and the prosecuting investigating team, has decided to institute prosecution.
Yes, well, is it a convenient time?
Thank you.
We'll take it.
Well, there you have it. The court has adjourned for now. So let's start off right from the top as we take it with our focus today, Kendall, on the Finance Minister, Malusi Gigaba, who has extended SAA board chairperson Dudu Mnyani's term of office to November.
Absolutely, very interesting question there. Coming out of some heavy matters in court right now to bring you what we're doing on the show today. I want to find out from you, what do you make of SAA Board Chairperson Dudumi and his term extension at the SAA?
Let's take a look at what you are telling us on the Facebook page as well as on the Twitter handle at SABC News. Well, let's take a look. Well, we're also running a poll today. As you know, the court matters. Should the president have his day in court? Now, so far, Kendall, 339 votes in.
Yeah, 85% are saying yes, he should have his day in court. And as you've heard, the NPAs are being taken over some hot coals right now in Parliament. And it might just be that it happens that he has his day in court. But I want to find out from you what your thoughts on that are.
Lawrence Kapara says the law in South Africa is like a spider web. It catches small insects.
Ooh, very well put. Very interesting take there. Moluki Kito says, why not? He should prove if he's not guilty.
Well, those are some of your comments. You can keep coming and we'll read them as we continue. But we're also looking at a sports question today. Steve Compella and Kaizer Chiefs is in the news.
Absolutely. Steve Compella doing what no club has managed to do this season yet and beat Cape Town City. He even did that in Cape Town itself. I want to know what you think. Is this the rise of the Phoenix that Kaizer Chiefs is? What are your thoughts on this?
Ayatollah says, well done, Chiefs. Benny became so talkative in 5 games, only like he already won the cup and the league.
Kantashabisa says Chiefs had fresher legs. Noma Unjalo, I'm still not convinced that they can win away and win any silverware this season.
Well, there you have it. Those are some of your comments. We'll read them as we continue. But right now, let's take a look at your news headlines. The Supreme Court of Appeal currently hearing President Jacob Zuma and the National Prosecuting Authority's appeal against the High Court ruling relating to the spy tape saga. The National Union of Mine Workers intend to approach the High Court in Pretoria to support the Mineral Resources Minister Mosebenzi Zwane in his battle with the Chamber of Mines to implement the new mining charter. And Parliament's Standing Committee on Public Enterprises has given the Finance Minister, Malusi Gigaba, a week in which to explain the extension of SAA Board Chairperson Dudumiene's term of office. Also remember that that's part and parcel of our question as well. You can also tell us what's on your mind there. But before we get to the news, let's find out from Kendall Makamate what's happening in the sports world.
Elvis, thank you very much. Good morning. This is what we've got for you in the sports today. Steve Compella's decision to give teenager Wiseman Meyiwa a first-time start turns into a stroke of genius as the youngster fires Amakosi to a much-needed win in Cape Town.
For number 2. It's all over now. Meyiwa on debut. And Kaizer Chiefs are heading to all 3 points.
Cristiano Ronaldo marks his return from suspension with another brace as Real Madrid crush up FC 3-0 in the UEFA Champions League group stage match.
Gareth Bale looking for Ronaldo. 1-0 Real Madrid. In the blink of an eye.
Here we go. Bam! Out of there! Wow! What a shot!
Tisara Pereira smashes the World 11 to a series leveling win over Pakistan in an electric match that goes down to the last 2 balls. And of course, Hashim Nana getting an unbeaten 72 of 55 balls at that match. The decider will be tomorrow. All this and more a little later. For now, let's go back to Elvis, who's got the news.
Thank you, Kendall. Top story this hour. Judges at the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein have pointed out inconsistencies in the affidavits of the former NPA acting head, Mokotedi Mpshe, and then the SIU boss, Willie Hofmeyer. Now, this after the NPA counsel, Hilton Epstein, argued that Mpshe reviewed the decision from the then Scorpions boss, Leonard McCarthy, which he was entitled to. In April 2009, Mpshe withdrew the charges against the President Jacob Zuma, arguing that secret recordings between the former NPA head Bulelani Ngcuka as well as McCarthy pointed to political manipulation of the case. Zuma and the National Prosecuting Authority are challenging the High Court ruling, which found that the NPA's decision to drop hundreds of corruption charges against him was irrational.
We've been at this for 8.5 years. We're now at the second last
court that we can go to. But at issue here is, as you say, there is one law in South Africa. It applies to everyone, whether you are the president of South Africa or a homeless person. There is one law. He has been charged. A court has found unanimously that the dropping of the charges was illegal, irrational, and has set it aside. The appeal is now being heard, but if we win, then as far as we're concerned, Jacob Zuma is an accused person, like everybody else would be an accused person, and he must be summoned to a court and indicted accordingly.
Certainly not the end of this matter, because even if you look through President Jacob Zuma's court papers, they argue this issue around should the NPA decide to uphold and implement this decision by the High Court, that will give rise to an application for a permanent stay. Would the DA then also be involved in such a matter?
Well, of course, because really the issue is one of principle. The issue cannot be allowed to be frustrated at the last minute by legal shenanigans. Jacob Zuma has always said, I want my day in court. What we're trying to do is to give him his day in court.
An update on that story. Let's now go live to Bloemfontein, where our reporter Eldrin Sampier is standing by to give us the latest on some of the arguments that was brought forward by the NPA Council. A very good morning to you, Eldrin. Can you give us an update as to what transpired this morning?
Well, certainly, as you heard there, the arguments being brought by the NPA with regards to why they believe the decision taken by Mqotheni Mshe back in 2009 was rational. We also heard some harsh words from the justices, quite particularly Justice Kachalia, who said that Mqotheni Mshe plagiarized the case law that he invoked when he made that decision and when he briefed the media on the 6th of April in deciding why he believes that the prosecution against President Jacob Zuma should be dropped. Also an argument being made by the various justices here that just for the mere fact that there was interference with regards to the date on which President Jacob Zuma's indictment would be served on him does not mean that the prosecution itself has been tainted, because the decision had already been taken by the end of November that President Jacob Zuma should be prosecuted. So the the prosecution itself was not tainted, or the process thereof was not tainted, and it was just the date that was an issue, and there was interference with regards to the date, and of course the conversation that Bulelani Ngcuka, who was then the former NDPP, speaking to Lenneth McCarthy about saying that do not serve the indictment this weekend, do not serve the indictment, that does not mean that the process of prosecuting President Jacob Zuma, or then ANC presidential hopeful Jacob Zuma, was tainted. And that's the argument that we've been hearing coming through from the various justices, and as I've indicated, quite harsh on Mqotheni Mshe's conduct and the decision that Mqotheni Mshe made at the time. And remember, even the Deputy Judge President of the High Court, in handing down his judgment, said that Mqotheni Mshe did a half-hearted attempt at trying to investigate Lenneth McCarthy's conduct. It was 2 days before Mqotheni Mshe made the final decision not to prosecute Jacob Zuma, that he sent a note to Lenneth McCarthy as well as Bulelani Ngcuka, saying that they must explain the conduct, and Lenneth McCarthy, Bulelani Ngcuka then responded saying that they need access to those tapes so that they can respond. And the High Court said that that request from these two parties were reasonable, or was reasonable at the time. And yeah, so arguments still continue. We're still waiting for the two other councils to make their arguments. And just a point of clarity, I see that a lot of people don't understand whether leave to appeal has been granted or not. So what's happened in this case, like with the Al-Bashir case as well, when it was being heard here at the Supreme Court of Appeal, is that what the court decided, and this time it's decided the same thing as well, that the merits of the appeals case will be debated and argued in court, but also the appeal itself will be argued in court, and that's what we're currently hearing at the moment.
Eldrin, thank you so much for that update. That was our reporter Eldrin Sampier. He'll keep us updated on the case there today. Now, President Jacob Zuma has survived numerous bruising court battles over the years, mostly involving graft accusations and motions of no confidence in Parliament, as well as calls for him to resign. Earlier, we talked to Professor Lesiba Tefu in Pretoria.
I've heard on numerous occasions the head of state say, I would like to clear my name, I would like to have my day in court. But he has tried everything possible within the limits of the law to ensure that that day doesn't eventuate. And that's what is regrettable. And I hear people say, we are all equal before the law. Yes, indeed it is so. And it was the former head of state, Nelson Mandela, when challenged by Dr. Louis Late, and he said, yes, I will appear before the court. For as this nascent democracy is what it is, we must ensure that people believe in the rule of law and believe in the equality before the law. He set a good precedent, and I would have hoped that if the man was innocent, he would avail himself and let this matter be laid to rest once and for all.
How do you view the work of this Riti Commission, who exonerated the president of all these charges?
Well, I've never been a friend of the Riti Commission because the chairperson, Willie, the judge, was himself more in the news than what he was meant to do. To the extent that two of highly learned and respected guys, the lawyer and the judge president now of Mpumalanga, had to step down because they said there is a second agenda here perpetuated by the chairperson. I think that's enough. And the prosecutor also stepped aside. Those who were intended to submit evidence, they also said it is no longer worth it. And in the main, it had to do with the chairperson, unfortunately, and a highly learned legal jurisprudence scholar. But unfortunately, I suspect he will go down in the annals of history as one of those judges who failed to live up to the oath of the office.
It seems today as if there's a fracture between the judiciary and the executive at times. Is this part of the reason why we exist in this kind of climate today, you think?
Yesterday I was just talking to some people on some of these matters. You know, politicians are an interesting species indeed. If you recall what was going on in the Judicial Service Commission, there were learned scholars, the legal persons, who would try to run down other legal persons and sought to transform the judiciary in the sense they thought they wanted to. But now some of them are out of the job, they've been fired by the president. Some of them are aspiring for the headship of the state. But they now need the judiciary more than they needed it then, when they ought to have defended it, when political opportunism informed the less learned who were in the judiciary to try to hammer anybody and any judge who sought to stand by the oath he took then. But well and good, at least as the last line of defense, the judiciary did as proud, did as well, and I think they are gaining more respect across the political spectrum, across the color line. Even indeed those who denounce and renounce them yesterday, now they recognize and appreciate that we must respect them by all means possible.
Professor, let's talk about the current political situation in South Africa, because we're in a very interesting time. I think we can all agree we're heading into an elective conference, and some would say all is on the line a little bit at the moment. How do you view what is happening right now, and how do you expect what's happening in court today will play out in the months to come?
Oh yes, I really, my sympathies go to the ruling party. 2 days ago, it was in Durban. I mean, that was a major blow to the body politic of the African National Congress. Today, here we are, it's also about the head of state. It cannot be good to the public image of the party that perpetually they are in court and almost every time they lose out. It cannot be correct for them. At least in the court of public opinion, I think they are losing out big deal. Now, that's one. The second thing says to me, what does it say to the unity that they want? Because there are factions. I'm sure there are those who are happy that this matter is going on because it will serve the interests of their faction, and there are others on the opposite side. Equally, even with the KwaZulu-Natal. But most importantly, the KwaZulu-Natal case also gave at least reason, belief, courage, and conviction that if you feel offended, go to the court and the court will pronounce in your favor if you so deserve. So I see more challenges, and there are already several court cases that you know that are coming from the branches. The list for the elective conference. So it is not a good time, and all these appearances in the court are not good for them.
Well, that is why we're asking you this question on our poll today. If we put it up there and we look at the numbers and what they suggest, we're asking you, should the president have his day in court? Well, 339 of you have voted thus far. 22 hours left to vote. 85% are saying yes. The president should have his day in court. Only 15% are saying no. But right now, let's go back to Bloemfontein.
The following reasoning and conclusion: that in the light of the Constitutional Court decisions and in the light of your being bound by Justice Haram's conclusions, that the decision is invalidated for that purpose, for that reason.
Well, Justice Nafsa, can I revert on the question for two reasons? One, it's a concession I would have to make, and I tried to distinguish it. I would like to take instructions from the principal.
Well, I think you should.
I would also like to hear what Mr. Kemp has to say. Maybe he's got an answer that I don't know of.
Yes, but I mean, you're independent counsel.
I am, but maybe I haven't thought of a legal argument, and that's what matters. Maybe there is a legal argument.
All right, my brother Leach has a question for you.
Epstein, I'm just concerned about one thing. Your entire case is that McCarthy's actions in delaying until after Polokwane, the actual service of the summons, of the indictment, had as its motivation the advantaging of Mr. Mbeki's chances rather than those of Mr. Zuma. In a nutshell, and that allegation is made repetitively by Mr. Hofmeyr in his affidavit, on what facts do you rely to support that conclusion?
It's purely the recordings which are mentioned in Mshe's statement. You would have seen that there's a transcript of what he said, and then there's a comment.
Could you take us to the specific parts of the transcripts, and so we can look at those and see if the conclusions are justified? What volume are you in? It's one of the supplementary volumes, is it not?
I'm in the core bundle, volume 6, at page 1092. Is it in? It's also in the main bundle, I think, in volume 1.
Yes. All right, so what you're in core bundle volume 6, what page?
1092 is the start of Mshe's statement.
That's the statement.
That's the statement, because when he attaches the recordings, the recordings are attached in my papers at 1097.
Well, which particular recordings, and let's see what meaning you ascribe to them.
So under allegations of abuse of process and recording of telephone calls, it says calls about manipulating the timing of charges for other purposes. LM, which is Leonard McCarthy. The second thing is, I remember what you said, and I was talking to Bulelani and Nuka. I remember what you said on Saturday. I read yesterday's Business Day editorial. You must read it. Nuka, just remind me, McCarthy, yes, it's in line with your thinking. And then the comment is the
editorial. Sorry, could I just ask you that the Business Day editorial seemed to have been that it serves Zuma's purpose not to institute before Polokwane. Is that correct?
Well, I can only look at the comment of that. The editorial is of the view that appears to benefit Mr. Mbeki, where Mr. Zuma is not facing charges.
Well, I mean...
And he said it's in line with your thinking.
Isn't that debatable, in a sense? It's debatable. I mean, if he'd been charged before Polokwane, who knows whether his charges would be better or not? I mean,
it is. So they draw inferences, and one looks at a conspectus of all of what follows.
Okay, so it's the first one? Which other?
No, that's the first one. The second one is, the third issue is I met with the guy I mentioned, and you know his line is almost like that of Sam. There's laughter, but he says he will speak to the man, but he is back over the weekend, but he feels very strongly that I should not see the guy directly. The comment is there is reference to the need to meet or discuss with the man, the other guy fellow. It is clear that it is the president, that's Mbeki. In most cases, it is not clear who is meant.
Well, do we know that for sure? I mean, let's assume for the moment that Mr. McCarthy is a Mbeki supporter. But how do we get to this conclusion?
Let's go to number 6. So,
yes.
Number 6. So you're the only one who can just save the country from this madness. And then further down, and what does the big man say? Is he all right? I want to still try to call him later tonight. He's in a meeting the whole day at Shell House of places. I did what you said I should do. You did the right thing. Then McCarthy, up until Friday, I received a strong memorandum to say charge now. Nuka says Friday. McCarthy says no, this Friday. The team says that we have been messing around with this thing. We are allowing ulterior considerations to come in. It will become an impossibility later. We now must take action and deal with finish and class, Jackie Salibi said. But we will talk when I see you.
Well, could we stop at that one? That is, they're dealing with Downer and the prosecutors on the ground being intent that this thing must be pushed along.
Yes.
And so that says, they say we've been messing around with this thing, we're allowing ulterior considerations. So they're concerned about what the team is thinking. So
now, the next one, I think, follows from that. McCarthy said, but listen, I think you guys must keep your heads open about when factor. Because I mean, we will file our docs tomorrow, and Mshe's going on leave tomorrow, and I'm acting. And the comment is the when factor.
Sorry, isn't that neutral? You must keep your heads open about the when factor.
Well, the when factor.
Why is that prescriptive, rather than it being keeping an open mind?
So the comment is the when factor is an apparent reference to whether Mr. Zuma should be charged before or after Polokwane.
But who makes that comment?
That's made by McCarthy. I think you must keep your heads open about the when factor.
The comment in the margin.
Oh, who makes those comments?
Is it the NIA?
No, I don't think that's the NIA. It must be.
Whose comments are?
I imagine I think it's the NPA, but I imagine it's some Mshe's comments, Hoffman's comments.
Well, do we know for sure?
No, aren't those the references? Sorry, is that not the references? Did the DA not explain those in there? Well, I don't know.
No. Well, tell us. I mean, I'd like to know. Were these the representations that were made by Mr. Zuma's team, or were these instilled in the margin by the NIA?
I will see if there's reference to it. I haven't seen reference.
So what do we do with those in the margin? I mean, that's the view of somebody.
He says at the beginning, I will now deal with the contents of some of the recordings as set out below. I believe that is in the public interest to make this available, as this matter is of huge public interest, and I believe that it's important for members of the public to be able to draw their own conclusions.
You are now reading it to number what?
Conduct. I was reading this to 20. I wanted to see if he indicated there whose comments these are.
But I mean, can we take them into account at all? We don't even know who made these comments.
But there are comments that Mshe clearly has relied upon, whether they were his own comments or whether they were comments of others given to him about what this meant. He's relied on these comments and the inferences drawn from them.
Okay. But I mean, as I put to you, if you look at the one date Wednesday the 12th, where McCarthy is speaking, far from that being prescriptive or manipulative, it seems to say we'll keep our options open.
Well, the next one, following at the bottom of that page, as long as you don't do it this weekend, McCarthy, if we hold it back, it will be because the clever people like you and others are saying to us that the country needs cool heads. But I would hate to have be seen to be wrong later.
But why is that too? Why is that particularly nefarious or to be decried? I mean, this is saying as I understood it, if you take into account what Minister Mabandla herself thought and Minister Castles at the time, that you just got to keep a cool head. Let's not let this not lead to instability. Why is that in itself?
But he's saying just don't do it this weekend.
No, but hold on a second. let's come back to that. It's not Bulelani Ngcuka who we are directly concerned with here, even though what Mr. Hofmeyr quite unflatteringly refers to that Bulelani Ngcuka was, for practical purposes, Mr. McCarthy's handler. But let's leave that for a moment. He says as long as you don't do it this weekend, Mr. Ngcuka seems to be pushing. Leonard McCarthy, on the other hand, seems more reticent. So he says, firstly, keep an open mind. Second, he says, well, if we don't do it by this weekend, it would have been because several people, including you yourself, Mr. Ngcuka, the clever people, would have prevailed. But Leonard McCarthy does not seem to be sort of driving or pushing this by any means. Am I wrong in that?
Well,
doesn't the top of the next page support my brother Kachalia? Just look at the top of it.
McCarthy says it might change. Ngcuka says, I can't keep an open mind. You can't do it this weekend. Our minds won't change. And then he says, just don't do it this weekend. And McCarthy then capitulates. And he says, I won't move this weekend. If this changed, just let us know. And Ngcuka says, it won't change. But this also has to be seen in the entire context of this. It follows over the page. McCarthy says, I will get, this is now, the date is the 13th of December, just before Polokwane. And he says, I will rather come myself. I want to drop off a parcel, but he wants to hand it to him personally.
But the comment in the margin, and I don't know whether it's right or not, that's the difficulty with these comments. It was to deliver a draft of the Concord Papers.
But the inference they drew was when he said, Zuma will say we're conspiring against him, McCarthy says, can I ask, the script has not yet changed, it's not changed yet. And the script, they say, is, the position of the script is apparent references to whether Zuma should be charged before or after Polokwane. But I can't tell you, Justice Nabsa, on whose inferences these were.
No, but look at
what you relied on.
Look at the last comment by McCarthy before Friday the 14th, because I feel like going to Polokwane and charging him there. So far from wanting to put it off, Mr. McCarthy is saying, much like the Downer and company was saying, let's go and charge him.
But he listens to Ngcuka. That's the problem. He listens to him.
He also listens to Minister Mabandla.
And where from these references and these transcripts, where's the quantum leap between the what gives rise to the quantum leap between the delay of the prosecution, or when to charge, and the advantage, the perceived advantage of the then presiding president, Mr. Mbeki?
So again, in context, when Mshe listens to all of this, what does he know? He doesn't only know what he reads or hears. He knows that he bumped into McCarthy at the airport, and McCarthy makes comments to him that Hofmeyr is not being loyal to Mbeki, and they have a heated exchange about that. So he now knows that McCarthy, and he says to McCarthy, it's not right for you as a prosecutor to raise this. You shouldn't get involved in these matters at all. And they have a heated exchange. Then, of course, he sees that in the context of the Browse-Moll report. Now the Browse-Moll report has been leaked. He knows about it. He knows that McCarthy was instrumental and behind what Mr. Trump calls fake news and the information peddling.
I'm not sure.
And so in the light of that, he knows what he was doing in the Browse-Moll report. He's tried to leak information to discredit
could I ask you to turn to the page 1101 in the core bundle? Right at the top, under date 16th of the 12th. Do you have it? Where Leonard McCarthy's initials. Do you have it?
Yes.
I have been advised, he says, this is not McCarthy driving anything, to give Obud and Oyan a break in the interest of South Africa. Tenuous times, I suppose the QV is Quo Vadis. So again, he's not saying it's my agenda or I want to do this. He's saying I've been told. And the reality is that Minister Mabandla did tell him, you can't do this now. So what my brother Leach is putting to you is, if this is all the material you rely on, then it's conjecture and speculation and assumption.
Yes, it was conjecture, but based not on just what he heard here, but as I say, but based on the conduct of McCarthy in the Browse-Moore report and what he tried to achieve there.
But it coincided with his own view, which, having spoken to Minister Mabandla, he'd come to the view that it would be inappropriate to serve the indictment before Polokwane. That's why when he had a discussion with Mr. Downer, and Mr. Downer got upset, angry, correctly so, he then backed off and said, well, I assure you that this is not going to be Minister Mabandla's decision, it is my decision. Fact of the matter is he had come to that conclusion independently of what McCarthy's view was.
Justice Kachalia, the question then is, to what extent can a court draw inferences different from those which the decision maker drew with the information they had before him and the background information that he had?
That goes to rationality, because if the conclusions he drew are in fact not supported by hard fact or objectively verifiable fact, well, how do you get to rationality?
Well, it will go to rationality. The director sits with a power. The power is to continue or discontinue prosecution. The purpose is to make sure that whatever he does, that the integrity of the criminal justice system is not impugned, and based on that, he makes that decision. Now, what is happening here is a court and the court, I quote, second-guessed that and said, well, if we were sitting where you were, we wouldn't have made that decision, and therefore it's irrational.
Well, I'm not sure that it's quite as simple as that. It may not be quite as elegant as one would wish, but it seems to me that they took into account all of the things he should have considered.
Because McCarthy's conduct, I mean, the Joint Standing Committee and investigations, they found that his conduct in the Browse-Moore report was so reprehensible, and Pecolia told him to stop it, and he kept peddling this fake information, which was clearly to aid President Mbeki. And then you get these telephone calls, you put two and two together, and he draws that conclusion.
What is the Browse-Moore? The Browse-Moore report is completely unconnected to the prosecution in this case. He was an Mbeki supporter. This was a political campaign that he might have been in. That's the reprehensible part. But how did it impact on the prosecution?
Well, only because of what McCarthy's object was in the Browse-Moore fake news peddling, coupled with the fact that he then delays the prosecution when Downer says don't do it. And he's having these discussions with Nuka, who definitely doesn't want him to.
But my brother Leach asked you, where did he delay the prosecution? And we've now gone through the transcript of those recordings.
Not the indictment. He delayed the indictment. He made the decision.
Well,
the service of the indictment.
Where did he delay? Where can we say this delay was motivated in order to somehow undo the prosecution, or in fact to accelerate the prosecution? I mean, I'm not quite sure that I understand where it's all at.
Well, it was to make sure that if they proceed with the prosecution, it would not impact on the Polokwane conference. And they've got a prosecutorial process in progress, and they decide that they are going to hold back on it because it will influence the outcome of an election.
All right. All right. Shall we go to, if you're done with that part, can we go on to the next part where it's really territory, what's within the court's remit and what isn't?
The part where the court said he must face the charges in the indictment.
Yes.
We deal with that in our heads of argument. At page 55, I'm sorry, paragraph 55. Now the question is, the point is this. In the, I'm going to call the Harris DP decision, where they dealt with motion proceedings and then dealt with what Nicholson J. did in the matter before him, and where he dealt with matters which were not in fact issues in the court, where he dealt with political meddling, and the SCA said that it wasn't his role or his place to deal with any of the political meddling. Judges are part of the general citizenry, and judges must deal only with what is before them. Well, now, in this case, what was before the court quo was simply an application to set aside the decision and an order for costs. They did not ask that the court make a decision about what should happen to the charges.
Could I understand this? Mr. Abrams' concern seems to be that we, the prosecutors, we decide. It's not for courts to decide. That seems to me to be the driving force. Is that correct?
On this issue?
Yes.
Yes, that is so.
All right. Now, let me ask you this, and you're right. I mean, we accept, I think all of us on this panel accept, that it's our job to see whether somebody else has overstepped the mark. It's not our job ourselves to overstep the mark. That seems to me to be correct. But what is the effect of a prosecution, a decision on a prosecution that remains extant if the decision to undo it is set aside? I mean, as a matter of law and logic, what happens? It remains extant, doesn't it?
So there are two issues which arise. The first is, and really this court may feel that it's not within its ambit to give any direction on this, but the NDPP, Mr. Abrams, would like to know if this decision is set aside, what does he do? Does he face the charges, or is it for him to make a new decision? Now, the problem is this. When the decision is set aside, you just put to me, Justice.
I don't understand the difficulty.
But if I can just have a moment, please, Justice Richards. When the decision is set aside, the question is, which has just been put to me as I understand it, doesn't it revive the previous decision? The problem is that Justice...
Sorry, not revive. The effect of the decision not to prosecute, not to continue with the prosecution, is set aside. What remains is a decision already made. It's a matter of law and logic. That must be so.
So we draw the parallel with what happened before Msimangje. There, Mr. Zuma was facing prosecution. He came to court, the prosecutors weren't ready. The NPA was not ready. Msimangje says, call your first witness. They say, we can't, and he strikes the matter off the roll. And then Mr. Zuma's taken to court, and the charges against, well, he's in court, and the charges against him were then withdrawn. And the Constitutional Court in the Tint matter and in the SCA matter said what went before Msimang was spent, and a new decision had to be taken.
But that's correct, but that's because the jurisprudence is quite clear. When a matter is struck off the roll, that terminates the prosecution. We're dealing with something different here. What you have here is a decision to prosecute, made by Mr. Mshe, a decision which thus far has been unchallenged, legally, technically. You get to the point, that's point X. Now it gets to point Y where he says, I want to undo that decision. You say your undoing is invalid. All that remains as a matter of law and logic is the decision to prosecute, which has as yet not been set aside.
Justice Nafsa, I hear that, but there's a parallel with what happened in this matter, because after Mshe withdrew the charges, Mr. Zuma then went back into court, and the judge, the magistrate, said, the charges are withdrawn, you're free to go, I imagine, words to that effect. So he goes, the case is over. And there's no difference between him being struck off and saying the charges are now withdrawn, Mr. or this.
But it's almost a plus petitio, Mr. Epstein. If the legal effect of the striking off the roll, and we know what the jurisprudence is in relation to that, if the legal effect of that is that the prosecution is terminated, as in it's dead, you need a decision to revive it. This is very different, and I want to know why you say it's not different. You have a decision to prosecute, point X. You move beyond that, and that's up until now unchallenged. It's extant. Up until point Y. Point Y now is the attempt to undo it. If the attempt to undo it is invalid, then what do you have left as a matter of law, logic, and practical reality? And I want to know why it's not different.
Well, if I can take you in our heads to the decision of Brandtje in Freedom Under Law, there he was dealing with 6A of the NPA Act, where somebody has not pleaded. Mr. Zuma had not yet pleaded. So the question is, Brandtje says, as I see it, the withdrawal of a charge in terms of Section 6A is final. The prosecution can only be recommenced by a different original decision to reinstitute the proceedings, and unless and until it is revived in this way, the charge remains withdrawn. But there is another portion, I have to hasten to say, in the same judgment, which I've had difficulty reconciling, where Justice Brandt said that as soon as the charges were withdrawn, this was in the Luli matter, they were automatically reinstated. As soon as the decision was set aside, they were automatically reinstated. And I think that's what you're putting to me, Justice Nelson. But
I'm not sure that I'm putting to you what Justice Brandt, and I think I was on that panel, was I not? But be that as it may, what I think he was referring to were proceedings in facie curiae, where if the charges are withdrawn in court, well, that's the end of the matter. Must be so. Yes. It's a judgment that I think was delivered last week by this court that says that, or that's the effect of it. It's withdrawn, it's the end of it. Non-constat, where the contestation is here, it's a civil contestation. The contestation is about whether the decision to withdraw is correct. Once that is set aside, the decision to prosecute, which is unchallenged, not set aside, there's no withdrawal in facie curiae. It's as a result of a decision by the court as to the validity of what Mr. Mshe did.
So it raises this problem. With the Nicholson J judgment, where the decision to prosecute had been, so just to put in perspective, 2007, after Polokwane, Mshe makes the decision to prosecute. That is challenged by Zuma. It comes before Nicholson. Nicholson J upholds the review, and he sets aside the decision to prosecute. But before he's taken to court and the charges are withdrawn, there's an appeal. So when the decision was made by the SCA, by Justice Harms and Justice Kachalia, when that decision was made, he hadn't been into court. So the decision was reinstated. That's clear. In this instance, he's taken to court and the charges are withdrawn. And because 7 years, 2007, how many years? 10 years later, does the same decision still exist? That's the question, and that's what Mr. Abrams would like to know.
Technically, you are correct. They did go, and once they'd made a decision, whether if that decision is unlawful, well, it's unlawful. They then went into court, in a sense, to formalize that decision. But, you know, lawyers and courts have a way sometimes of getting involved in very, very technical arguments. Let me ask you, pertinently, what is Mr. Abrams' anxiety? Because if that decision is set aside, then, as my colleague presiding puts to you, ordinarily, whatever technical hoops you're going to jump through, you will carry on with the prosecution. If Mr. Abrams' concern is that he has to apply his mind afresh to this whole case, we're going to be here 9 years later. Then there'll be another review application. And so my anxiety is somehow or the other, after 9 years, this matter, one way or the other, either there's going to be a permanent stay and this case is over, or the prosecution is going to continue. Those are the simple questions. So what is Mr. Abrams' problem?
Justice Kachalia, I haven't heard what Mr. Kemp is going to do or say about this, and whether Mr. Kemp is going to make a state that Mr. Abrams would have to make a new decision, or whether the position is that the existing, the decision set aside, never mind it's 10 years ago, still stands. So either it still stands and then you must say to Mr. Zuma, you must now come to court, or a new decision has to be taken. I mean, there may be new, I don't know what's happened in 10 years, but
what I'm concerned about is he pitches it at the level of courts are entering into terrain that they shouldn't be entering into. That's the position that you are constrained to submit. We are aware of the constraints on our power, but I don't understand why that arises for him as an anxiety, as my brother Kachalia puts to you, because if the reasoning is the charges, there was a decision to prosecute, the decision to undo the prosecution, and in a very real sense, it's almost contradictory. Your client doesn't take into account the withdrawal of the charges as being something that terminated the thing. He terminated it by virtue of a decision he made.
So it was only advanced justice Nafs on the basis of the lack of clarity when one looks at the Msimang consequence and what was said in the Tint matter by Justice Holmes, that what went before once it was spent.
Just explain this to me. Am I missing something in respect of the record? Because after Msimang J strikes it from the roll, isn't there an acceptance by the prosecutorial team that they've got to start de novo?
Once it was struck from the roll,
yes,
they would have to start de novo. Yeah. And it seems with a new decision.
Yeah, well, isn't that what was accepted?
Yes.
Now, where does this anxiety come from? The prosecutorial team, of which Mr. Mshe and now Mr. Abrams is the leader, the head, nominally he's bound by what happened by his predecessor unless he wants to have it set aside. So he knows that the prosecutorial team, a la Downer and the others, knew they had to start again. That's in fact what they did. That's why they put together this whole new indictment. That's why they wanted to include the racketeering charges. That's why they were intent on putting everything in place to get that indictment going. Now, if that was the position, historically and sequentially and chronologically, what's the difficulty now? Where does this anxiety suddenly come from?
It's not sudden. It's not sudden. It may not be within the domain of the court to deal with what the consequence is, and I shouldn't be asking the court for an opinion. But 10 years later, and it's taken a long time to get here, it would be helpful if the court could give a direction as to whether the judgment following Msimang and the judgment of Harmse are not applicable here, and that the charges are in fact now,
no, but sorry,
the decision is reinstated.
Tell me what in the Haram's judgment or in any other judgment undoes the question of the prosecutorial decision to continue prosecuting de novo. I mean, I'm just trying to understand what it is that militates. Why is there an undoing of the decision to prosecute? What undoes it?
Can I just find the judgment and refer you to the passage which I believe does that? You got the hand?
Which judgment is this? Democratic Alliance or?
No, this is the
Haram's judgment.
The Haram's judgment.
Well, that's national. It's 2009 2 SA.
Yes, I've got it.
What particular paragraph?
Paragraph 75.
So you just give us an opportunity to get there. Yes.
In addition, the court says, in addition, as held by the Constitutional Court, as soon as the matter had been struck from the roll by Msimang J, the criminal proceedings were terminated and the proceedings were no longer pending. Removal of a matter from the roll aborts the trial proceedings. The effect of this is that what went before the shared decision was spent and a new decision to prosecute was required. The Mshe decision was not simply a review of the Mnuka decision, which was no longer extant. On these facts, 1795 DID, irrespective of whichever interpretation correct, no application of Mr. Zuma's reliance on it was misplaced.
I don't get it, Mr. Epstein. Maybe it's that time of day. Maybe we've been sitting too long. But I'm not quite sure where the confusion comes from.
Whether it's removed because the prosecution is not ready to proceed and it's struck from the roll, or whether it doesn't proceed because the charges are withdrawn because of the Mshe decision, the fact is that those proceedings are spent. And according to this, as I read it, a new decision is required. If I'm wrong, it's simply a matter of whether or not, because there's been uncertainty. And the academics who
chronologically, let's place 75 in perspective. I thought we agreed that Downer and Company, there's people on the ground, prosecutors on the ground, knew that a decision to prosecute de novo had to be taken. That is what Mshe did. Took a new decision. The Msimang decision had gone before it. It's what necessitated the new decision. He made that decision. He then sought to undo that decision. The undoing is invalid. Why doesn't the previous decision remain extant? I'm just struggling to grapple with this.
Because by striking the matter off the roll in the Msimang matter, just because the prosecution wasn't ready, did not mean that a new decision had to be made. They could have come back when they wanted to.
Okay,
but the court said that a new decision is required.
Can you accept this?
I'm sorry, Jessica Chap, I want to say, if a new decision is not required, it's not a problem. But we need to, Mr. Abrams wants to know what to do.
I understand you want clarity, and I understand technically, if one reads this, it may well be that so the proceedings are aborted. But let's just think through this practically. Practically, if the decision, Mshe's decision, is set aside, the matter has now been struck off. Ordinarily, the prosecution would continue. Now, it may well be 9 years later that the NDPP says, in the 9 years, key bits of evidence and information have disappeared. Hypothetically, let's assume that. I'm not inviting anybody to let the evidence disappear, but I'm telling you that the evidence may have disappeared. In which case, the National Director will be within his rights not to continue a prosecution, just as you can stop a prosecution midway through a trial if evidence is unavailable or whatever. So ordinarily, if we make a decision to set aside this decision, then the National Director must understand that he must continue it, unless there's some reason why he can't.
Yeah.
And it's as simple as that.
I will accept the argument you put to me, with respect.
Okay, so in a sense, it's chicken soup, isn't it?
On that basis of what's been put to me...
but it would be chicken soup, wouldn't it? I mean, he subsequently took a new decision, a new and improved set of an indictment.
We will accept that, but I don't know if the court will find it
all right, so we've done
to put it to deal with it in the judgment. The only question is, and if it really matters, is we say that the court should not have said he must face the charges.
No, but I mean, that's just sort of, if that's the logical consequence, it's not the state saying we are prosecutors and we've made the decision.
No, I think with respect to the Court of Code, it shouldn't have been said because it oversteps the boundaries of the separation of powers, and that's exactly what happened with Judge Murphy and Judge Brunt. Said it wasn't within his domain to tell the prosecution what to do. But again,
could I ask you this? If instead of in an order, we were to say in a paragraph, if we inclined against you, only in the event that we incline against you, and we found either on the technical point or on the facts, or we affirm what the court below did, what would be objectionable if in a penultimate or ultimate paragraph one were to say the decision is going to be set aside? The logical consequence of that is that the decision to prosecute made by Mr. Mshe remains extant.
But I've no difficulty with it.
Okay. All right. If we incline against you, costs?
Before you address the issue of costs, there's an earlier question that I asked, and I couldn't find the reference there. The proposition I was making was that the timing could be irrelevant. The discussion of the timing could be irrelevant because the indictment was not ready. In fact, it was only ready sometime in December. I couldn't find the reference to it, but I've found it now. It's in page 378 in Mr. Hofmeyer's answering affidavit, where he says that in paragraph 220, that Downer proceeded to finalize the indictment. It was finalized on 24 December 2007. And for me, that suggested that their discussion of the timing then is irrelevant because there was no way the indictment could have been served before the 24th of December in any way.
Well, Justice Chiki, two things. I think one draws the inference that as soon as the Polokwane was over and there's the discussion which is referred to that was recorded when they said they've got blood all over their faces, now an egg all over their faces, and the very next day Zuma was charged. And I think if the indictment, it seems, was ready because, as I understand it, there's authority that the poker certificate is only needs to be ready at the time the accused pleads, so you can serve an indictment without it.
Well, what I'm referring you to is what Mr. Hofmeyer says in his affidavit, that in fact it was only ready on the 24th of December, well after Polokwane.
Mr. Epstein, before you go over to costs, there is one thing that did bother me in respect of the legality of the transcriptions. The NIA seems to have suggested, and tell me if I'm wrong, that they'd obtained permission from a judge to intercept telephone conversations of McCarthy. That's the only reference to legality in respect of. Well, what about the Downer, sort of Downer's soul and all the others? Where is the legality for that? For the interception of those of those telephone calls?
I'm not sure who Downer, was talking to. If he was talking in the same conversations.
No, there was a discussion between him and Mr. Soul, and then there was discussion between Mr. Casles and someone else, wasn't there? But where is the authority for that?
Justice Neff says, I understand how it came about is as a result of the browse mole leakage and the unhappy of Zuma Vavi, a task team was put in place, and that it was because of that the authorizations were obtained. And I won't be able to point you to where those authorizations are because I don't think they're in this record anywhere except a statement to say that they obtained permission from NIA to use them and release them.
No. That's a different question. That's whether or not Mr. Mshea was in the clear in respect of his use of them. But what I'm putting to you is that I understand it's the Browse-Mole report that sort of prompted this application for authorization and that the authorization was obtained. But the authorization appears to have been obtained in relation to intercepting Mr. McCarthy's communications. And no one else's.
I don't know to what extent it was limited. I actually don't. I haven't seen that authorization. I don't think it's in this record.
All right.
I'm afraid I can't.
So if we incline against you, the costs should follow the result.
Yes, John. Thank you, John.
Mr. Kim.
Thank you, Justices. My co-counsel will move in, if you don't mind, while I address.
Perhaps we should just take a 5-minute break and stretch our legs.
Very well, that will be.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Midday Report here on the SABC News channel. You've just been watching live court proceedings, of course, from Bloemfontein in the Free State, where the spy tapes appeal was currently taking place. And President Jacob Zuma's lawyers are currently arguing that the process to prosecute and indict him was actually flawed, as the court had previously ruled. But the bone of contention was the timing of that indictment. And of course, the court says that, yes, they ruled that the intentions of course, the prosecution does not surpass the actual charge sheet and, of course, the date of indictment. As you would know, that everybody's contesting the fact that President Jacob Zuma actually